So in this video, we're going to be discussing some basics of psychology, mainly getting you introduced to some of the basic methods and ways of analyzing psychological data that we're going to get much more into in future lectures. So I wanted to start off with the very basics, what do psychologists study? And we often typify these as the ABCs of psychology. So the A in this case stands for affect, which is the word psychologists often use to typify emotion, but really anything having to do with emotions. So not only emotions themselves, but how thoughts tie to emotions, social emotions, implicit or unconscious emotions, manipulating emotions, all these have to do with affect. So really it's like a branch of psychology all on its own at this point. Also, similarly, is a branch of psychology having to do with behavior. So that's encompasses almost all psychology in some way, shape, or form, because it's pretty much what we can observe easily in other people, but the way people act, how they control their behavior, how they learn new behaviors, all that kind of stuff. And then the C, in this case, is cognition or thinking. So we have sort of going from internal to external, and cognition being the most internal, the most hard to measure, affect, being somewhat externalized in terms of facial expressions, and behavior being the most external. But we kind of organize them as the ABCs of psychology. So if it doesn't encompass one of these in some way, it's probably not psychology. And one thing that psychologists are really interested in are differences between people. And very often in psychology, we focus on individual differences. So how are we different in our personalities, our intellect, how we learn, our creativity? Obviously, mental disorders is a huge aspect of psychology. That would be clinical psychology. And then as you go out maybe into more social psychological spheres, you get into group differences. So how are liberals different from conservatives? How are people of one religion different from those of another? And then this can, of course, even branch out to societal differences, individualism versus collectivism. On the more individual level, how do worldviews affect us and how are worldviews different in different cultures? This is now getting to the realm more of sociology and maybe anthropology, but still psychologists are interested in societal differences, especially if they discover some interesting psychological effect. They might be interested, well, can we find this effect everywhere? So, that's one of the things the study of emotion really was interested in. Do people in Papua New Guinea display and experience emotions the same way we in the West do? That was something that Paul Ekman did a lot of research on. So psychologists, of course, were interested in the ABCs, but we're interested really in what affects them, what creates these individual and group and societal differences. And there are as many things as you can think of, as many psychologists are out there, you can think of different ways in which these things are affected. A big branch of psychology now, it's sort of the new thing, is looking at how our genes affect us. We call that behavioral genetics. How biology in general affects us. This could be looked at on a neuronal level, how neurons, neurotransmitters affect us, all the way up to just different areas of the brain, even the body, some interesting study in how bacteria in our gut may actually cause psychological effects like depression. But of course, where psychologists were mostly interested in the mind, so things like subjective worldviews, also personality can fit into that, how other individuals affect us, our family, friends, peers, even strangers, groups one belongs to. We often typify that as in-groups or groups that we're in on, or out-groups, other groups that we don't belong to. One's community, institutions like school, for example, but also like governments, churches, all that sort of stuff. One's own culture, other cultures. Again, if you go, you can almost look at any noun in the dictionary and think about how it might affect us. Food, culture, language, everything affects affect, behavior, and cognition. So psychology is really an endless pursuit of all the things that make us human, separate us humans, and make us different from one another. All that sort of stuff is encompassed in psychology, as long as it has something to do with affect, behavior, and cognition. So the way we talk about this in scientific terms is in terms of variables. And variables is quite simply anything that varies. So, for example, if you're studying something that really doesn't vary much, and that's hard to think of because there's almost some variance in anything that we look at, but let's say everyone on Earth had 2 eyes. Not true, of course, there's some people with no eyes or 1 eye, but let's say that everyone in the world had 2 eyes. In that case, it wouldn't be a variable because it wouldn't vary in that universe where that was true. So in that case, it would be really hard to study what the eyes do, why we have 2 of them, because there's no one to compare. There's no one who has maybe 1 eye or no eyes to compare them to. But in this universe, even that is a variable. So almost anything is a variable as long as there are some differences between people, even in the same person over time. As long as it varies, it's a variable. And getting more out of the abstract, we're more interested in two types of variables. So independent variables, these are the things that we manipulate as researchers. These are the things that we predict or hypothesize will affect affect, behavior, and cognitions. This is usually in an experiment the thing that we are directly manipulating. Could be the temperature of the room, could be exposure to a happy or sad movie. How do these things affect us? That's the independent variable. And then the dependent variable is what we measure afterwards. So we affect something in some way. Maybe we make people watch a sad movie. The dependent variable could be something like sad emotion. How we want to measure that, whether it's crying or frowning, or simply a survey measure asking how sad are you. That could be a dependent variable. A good mnemonic to separate the independent and dependent variable is that the dependent variable depends basically on the independent variable. So what your emotion is in the experiment depends on what the experimenter is exposing you to, or the independent variable, how you're being treated, or the way that you're asked to think or view the world. All of these things are being manipulated by the experimenter in classic studies. Now, another term that is often brought up, but more as something that we're not necessarily interested in, but we have to think about, especially when constructing experiments, is extraneous variables. We often call these confounds. So these are things that might affect participants in any number of ways that we aren't aware of. So for example, if we're looking at the effect of heat on aggression, let's say, lots of studies find that the hotter we are, the more aggressive we are. And we looked at differences in aggression between people who live in the South, which tends to be a lot harder, versus people who live in the northern climates, let's say like Maine or New York, where it gets a lot colder. We might find a big difference there. Maybe people in the South are more aggressive. But there's so many other things that differ between people who live in the South and people who live in the North, the Northeast, besides just the climate. So culture is very different, much more ethnic diversity in certain parts of the United States versus others, social and economic differences. So in this way, that wouldn't be a very good test of the effect of heat on aggression, because there's so many extraneous variables that can affect the dependent variable, in this case aggression. So that's why we often run experiments where we can isolate the environment, put people in a lab setting where we can control everything, randomize participants into different conditions. These are all things that we're going to talk about as attempts to try to eliminate the effect of extraneous variables, or try to eliminate confounds. So we're not going to get much into this right now, but I just wanted to introduce this term when I'm talking about independent, dependent variables. Extraneous variables is kind of anything else that can affect the DV, or the dependent variable. So most often in psychology and other sciences, we're interested in how does one variable affect the other. In this case, we're talking about how do independent variables affect dependent variables. So this is often typified in the titles of articles. I just wanted to show you a few real titles of actual articles to show you how, when you're looking through maybe a database like PsycInfo and looking for articles, oftentimes right off the bat you can tell what is an independent variable versus a dependent variable. Very often it will follow in the exact order that the independent variable comes first. So, for example, in this title, what is beautiful is good, physical attractiveness on first impressions of personality. Now, one thing you'll find in a lot of titles, that's why I included this as an example, is sometimes it'll have words in there that don't really relate directly to the experiment. So they throw in a little, phrase to kind of catch your attention, which is what is beautiful is good. But if you look at the next part, physical attractiveness on first impressions of personality, it's as simple as the order you see before you. So it literally is, you could read this as the effect of the independent variable, physical attractiveness, on the dependent variable, first impressions of personality. So right there, just looking at the order, you could probably tell that what experimenters are doing is exposing participants to different levels of physically attractive others. So in this case, they're manipulating the presentation of a physically attractive person versus non-physically attractive persons. That's the independent variable thing they're manipulating. And then they're measuring people's first impressions of these individuals' personality. So right there in the temporal order of the title, you can tell what's the IV and what's the DV. Here's another one that's maybe even more explicit, the effects of adult attachment on brain mechanisms of cognitive control. So again, most titles follow this. the effect of the thing they're manipulating, or the thing that they're varying between groups, adult attachment styles. In this case, they're measuring brain mechanisms of cognitive control. So even if you don't necessarily understand what adult attachment is or what they mean by brain mechanisms of cognitive control, just by looking at the order of words, especially the phrase effects of, whatever's going to follow that is the thing that they're manipulating or controlling or varying between groups, mainly the independent variable. Now, just to show you one that's a little bit more complicated, and these are actually rarer, is this one, on angry leaders and agreeable followers, how leaders' emotions and followers' personalities shape a motivation and team performance. So a very long title, for one thing. Again, we have that little statement before the colon that's just sort of to grab your attention. So we'll pay attention to what's after that. So again, you want to look for keywords like, well, in this case, it doesn't have effect, but they do have, let's see, and team performance. Oh, in this case, they have shape instead of effect. But here it's still the verb of, something affecting something else. So how leaders' emotions and followers' personalities. So what they're doing is they're laying out two independent variables. Leaders' emotions and followers' personalities, probably an interaction between the two, which we'll talk about a lot about interactions later on. Shape or effect, the dependent variable, which again, there are two of them, motivation and team performance. So what makes this a little more complicated is they're looking at multiple independent variables interacting on multiple dependent variables. And like I said, this is actually quite rare. That's kind of a complex study. Usually a researcher will kind of break something that complex down into multiple studies, but perhaps this is a topic in which it really is this interaction between variables that's what is very interesting. It's hard to break that down. So again, getting into the lingo of it, there are different aspects to independent variables that we'll talk a lot about, and one of them is levels. So how many levels you have an independent variable, this is totally determined by the researcher, but it just means how many ways are you splitting people into groups. So for example, and one that makes total naturalistic sense is gender. So if you're looking at the effect of gender on something like aggression or mental illness or personality, gender is a really easy one to split into two levels, female or male. But actually a lot of researchers will include a third level. It could be female, male, or transgender, female, male, or intersex. Again, it's whatever the experimenter is interested in. Usually experimenters are interested in the two groups that are, the vast majority, either females or males. So in this way, the independent variable gender has two levels, female and male. It gets a little more interesting when you talk about something that's not so binary, like schizophrenia. So schizophrenia, you can indeed have two levels. You could be looking at one group of non-schizophrenics and one group of schizophrenics. But the way we classify this in the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, so we usually classify schizophrenia as falling along four basic levels. So in this case, we could look at a group that has no schizophrenia. That would be like the control group. How do normal people behave in this circumstance? Versus people with paranoid schizophrenia, disorganized schizophrenia, or undifferentiated schizophrenia. But again, if we're only interested in maybe schizophrenics versus paranoid schizophrenics, we could have two levels. So again, I just want to emphasize that how many levels you have, totally contingent on what the research is about, what is important, how many groups you want to include in this study. So that's levels. So cells is something a little different. This is when we have multiple independent variables, which we're not going to talk a lot about in this lecture. That gets a little more complex, so we're going to save that toward later in the semester. But cells are when you combine multiple independent variables, like, for example, gender and schizophrenia, and then look at their effect on something, sort of interacting with each other. So what this would look like, we often like to draw these things out. You'll see these in a lot of articles, is a research design table. So in this case, we'd have two independent variables. So on the one hand, we'd have schizophrenia, and the other hand, gender. These are both things that we aren't manipulating as experimenters, but these are the groups that we're separating participants into to study them. And then these have different numbers of levels. So, for example, gender, of course, has female and male. In this case, we're going to treat the four levels of schizophrenia as differently. We have four different groups. So we'd have people without schizophrenia, people with paranoid, disorganized, and undifferentiated schizophrenia. So in this case, since we're we're classifying people along more than one independent variable, we're going to have cells. So here I'm just sort of color coding this, but in the experiment we would need, of course, women without schizophrenia. That would be one of the groups we'd investigate. And we'd also need women with the three different types of schizophrenia. So right there we have four different groups or cells. And then we need male correlates of each. So when you're looking at a research design, this is one of the reasons why scientists like to draw these out, is it clearly lays out your independent variables, your levels, different groups within each independent variable, and then the cells, which are the groups that arise out of all of the independent variables involved. And it's rare that you're going to have more than 2 independent variables. Oftentimes it gets a little too complex when you look at a study with, let's say, 5 independent variables with the effect of gender and schizophrenia and social economic status and race and all these other variables. It just gets too complex to visually lay out and to really interpret the data. So usually we stick to 2 or maybe 3 independent variables. So those are the different classifications or ways of looking at an independent variables in your research. But of course we have the dependent variable. Now this one's actually very easy because it fits right into our research design here. So when we talk about dependent variables, we're most often talking about what we call values. And a value is really just any number that falls in any of these groups. So in this case, it could be the mean for the GAF scale. I didn't mention that before, but when we look at this, it says in the example, in a study of effects of gender and schizophrenia on GAF, what GAF is, it stands for Global Assessment of Functioning. It's a scale on 1 to 100, where 100 means that people are functioning very well. They can hold down a job, they have friends, they're happy. And a 1 means they're not functioning at all. They're a danger to themselves and others. And of course, you can score anywhere in between. So it's a nice, easy score to understand. 100's good, 1's very, very bad. So in this case, the values could be the average GAF score of people in these different groups. So if we were to look at this, maybe we would have values very close to 100 in people without schizophrenia, which is what you'd expect. So with no mental illness, you'd expect to score around 100. You're functioning very well. But one reason why we might want to include these 2 independent variables, maybe we'd find very different results for women and men within one type of schizophrenia category, like paranoid schizophrenia. So in this case, guys have average of 34, women of 69. So the guys are suffering much more of paranoid schizophrenia than the women. Now I kind of made up these data points, so that might not necessarily be true, but it's just how this information might be laid out in a research article. So again, there might not be as much of a difference between men and women in disorganized type, but let's say they're functioning quite a bit worse than, of course, people without schizophrenia, and then those in undifferentiated type are faring the worst of all. So these average scores here are what we call values. So again, a value can be an average score, it can be individual scores, but it's just any score of the dependent variable. Okay, so that's a little bit on IVs and DVs. We're going to be using those acronyms a lot, so I hope you get comfortable with them, independent variables and dependent variables. But let's zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit more about just what science involves, the steps of science. So usually science starts with induction. So we're going to differentiate here in a bit between induction and deduction. Induction is just taking a bunch of observations. You might make this in everyday life. You might make this within science. For example, let's say you're doing an experiment on something and suddenly you observe something you didn't expect. Well, what you can do with those observations is you can make a theory out of them. So a theory is just any statement that is an explanation for how things are related to each other. Theory of gravity is that any body of mass will attract other bodies of mass. The theory of entropy is that whenever you change one or energy from one form to the other, some energy is dispersed or lost. So theories can be as general as that. In social psychology, we have lots of theories too that we'll get into. So let's say you're going about your everyday life, and an observation you make, and it seems a little silly, but it's an observation actually a lot of people have made, and there has been actually a lot of science on it, is that when you meet an attractive person and you get close enough to them, you go, man, that attractive person kind of smells good. Better than average. And you think to yourself, well, why is that the case? Is that they're using cologne, or is it that there's something about attractive people that just make them smell better? So after a lot of these observations have been made, historically and anecdotally and all that sort of stuff, psychologists have actually investigated this. So they've come up with theories. Why is it that attractive people seem to smell better than average? And so a theory, or actually many theories and several competing theories, have arisen out of that. One of the most popular theories is that the reason attractive people smell good is because they have good genes. And so it's not necessarily that being attractive makes you smell good. It's that having good genes, meaning genes that promote healthy, good health, good reproductive potential, good potential to pass on your genes, all that kind of stuff, tend to also create what we interpret to be a very nice body odor. And this could be an evolved response. Maybe we sort of learn to pick out potential mates, people with good genes, people who would make good offspring by the way they smell. And so from people who could naturally detect that sort of thing through their nose, they were more likely to mate with people with good genes, pass on their genes, and thus pass on that trait of being able to smell out someone with good genes because they have good mating potential. So that's an interesting little evolutionary theory for why attractive people smell good by and large. So in this case, the theory is, of course, talking about a phenomena that we're interested in. So this wonderfully pleasant body odor for attractive people. And the most interesting part of it is just trying to explain the cause of it. So what is the cause of this phenomena? In this case, it hypothesizes that it's good genes. Well, here, that's a little bit of a misnomer. I use the word hypothesis and theory interchangeably there. They're somewhat different. So a theory, this is actually a good segue, a theory is an explanation for why phenomena arises. And from that, we derive hypotheses. So that's the induction part, is taking observations, creating a statement that tries to explain those observations, and then deduction is taking a theory or an explanation and then trying to test it formally. So what a theory is, again, is an explanation for why phenomena arises or what causes it. A hypothesis is when you take that explanation, can you make a prediction that then you can test with data? So a lot of people, and myself included, I just sort of accidentally did this, use theory and hypothesis interchangeably. In the way we just talk in English, that often happens. But in science, we do like to differentiate them. So theories are general explanations of phenomenon. Hypotheses are predictions we can test with data that are then, of course, based on theories, help support theories or refute theories. But, hypotheses are a prediction that we can test with data. So let's say that we are interested in testing this. On the most basic level, one thing we'd want to test, or one prediction we would make that we could test from this theory, is that physically attractive people should be rated as better smelling than unattractive people. Before we get into maybe a specific cause of it, maybe we just want to look at, is this true? If, it's just anecdotal evidence we have so far that we've met a few attractive people, they seem to smell good. Let's say we want to test this with an actual sample of participants. So right here we have a hypothesis, we have a prediction. Physically attractive people should smell better than unattractive people. But one of the problems with this prediction is that it's a little vague in the way it's worded. So we maybe want to specify exactly how we're going to be measuring all this stuff, like physical attraction, how good something smells, and there are lots of different ways to do that. So we can take this hypothesis and from this try to define exactly how everything's going to be measured. And these are what we call operational definitions. So in this case, we have two things we need to measure. I tried to make this kind of a simple example for the beginning. So really, we just have one independent variable. So we have to measure how physically attractive people are, maybe split them up into two groups, one group being physically attractive and one group being relatively unattractive. So our two levels of our independent variable. And then our DV, how good people smell. So like I was saying, the way we measure this is called operational definition. Exactly how something's going to be manipulated or chosen between groups or measured in the case of the DV. So before we get into, further into this exact study, let's think a little bit more about operational definitions, because especially for social sciences, for psychology, when we're talking about emotion and the mind, these are very subjective things. These are things that are hard to measure objectively, much more so than just a chemical reaction or the weight of something. It's hard to measure, for example, anxiety. There's no perfect way to measure how anxious someone is. You can think of ways, so you can measure heart rate, for example. Maybe a more sophisticated way of measuring anxiety is cortisol levels, because cortisol is a hormone that gets released when people are stressed out. Heart rate's not perfect because people could have a high heart rate just because they were exercising, or maybe even because they were sexually excited, which we would differentiate from general anxiety. But cortisol might zero in more on anxiety. But no measure is perfect. So different ways to measure anxiety. There are lots of different ways to measure intelligence. You can make people take an IQ test. Lots of people have shown figures of blocks, and then they give you a big selection of different types and shapes and sizes of blocks. And they say, recreate this figure. So how quickly can you do that? How well can you remember things like a long string of random numbers? And one area of interest I have is prejudice, and there are tons of ways to measure prejudice. So for example, we could have people pretend that they're bosses or juries or someone that has to make an important decision, and have them look at applications or defendants or basically other individuals who are different ethnicities, religions, whatever, and then look at how their decisions are biased by what group these people are in. So if you're a boss, are you more likely to hire a white person than a black person, even if they're of similar qualifications? Maybe an easier way is just to look at social distancing. So when you have people of two different groups interact, let's say a gay person and a straight person interact, how far away does the straight person sit from the gay person? If you have one give a pen or a paper to another, do they reach and take the pen closer to the other person's hand, or they sort of handle the very tip of the pen, try not to make too much contact? There are lots of different ways to measure bias or how uncomfortable people are with people of other groups. So I just wanted to give you some examples of how in social science it can often be very hard to come up with a one right way to measure something. That's why we often have many different operational definitions for the same basic construct or same basic variable. Actually, a really interesting one, I just wanted to throw this one in to show you how many different ways there are to measure one thing, is aggression. We'll talk about aggression later on in this lecture. So aggression is a really interesting one in that it's really hard to come up with one way to measure it. And sometimes measurements will come up with very different assessments of aggression. So for example, you could give someone a survey and say, okay, how would you react if someone, for example, insults your friend, or someone bumps into you, or someone cuts you off in traffic, these hypothetical scenarios. And depending on how they answer, you could measure that as aggression. Will you ignore it? Will you curse back at them? Will you try to hit the other person? Different levels of aggression. Lots of studies have used video games to measure aggression. So if you give the option of playing a non-violent video game, like Flower, or sometimes it's even hard to think of non-violent video games, but sort of fill it in there, versus a violent video game like Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto or something like that, what do people choose? Well, people who are aggressive tend to want to play more aggressive or violent video games. Of course, you could look at people's criminal records. That's sort of an extreme version of aggression. Look at road rage, either in real car driving scenarios or maybe in a car racing video game or simulation. One I think is kind of fun is where you implant someone who's very rude in the experiment, so it could be the experimenter himself or an actor, and then see how likely it is that participants will act rudely toward them by interrupting them, insulting them, whatever. And then one that's been kicked around a lot, I think it's an interesting measure of aggression, if not a perfect one, is one where they give the participant a plate of chips, and it has actually been used quite a bit, and they say, we're going to give these chips to someone else. Your job is to put as much hot sauce on them as you'd like, but just so you know, the person who you're giving them to really doesn't like hot sauce. So, previous parts of the experiment, they might make this relationship with the other person kind of antagonistic. Maybe this person insulted you in some way or isn't cooperating in the experiment. So then they measure aggression toward that person by how much hot sauce you put on their chips. Of course, there is oftentimes no other person. They're just measuring how much you'd aggress towards this person you think exists. So some of these seem very convoluted. Some of them seem more straightforward, like a criminal record. But all of them are ways to operationalize this given variable. So I threw in all these examples just to show you. I think aggression is a really interesting one because there are so many ways to operationally define it. But just to show you that for every variable you have almost unlimited ways, especially in the social sciences, of trying to measure it or manipulate it. And this is one of the things that makes replication really necessary for psychological studies. So, if we're physicists and we're measuring how a proton smashes into another proton, what happens? We discover like the Higgs boson particle or something. You can do that once, and if it comes out true, you've proven it true. You say, well, we found this result. It's very likely this will happen again in the future. At least, if we do it exactly the same way, it'll happen again in the future. But when it comes to making people more or less aggressive, or seeing differences in aggressive versus non-aggressive people, you can show something once and then figure out, well, maybe we didn't operationally define it right, maybe we didn't measure or manipulate it right. Let's do it again and again and again, make sure we're really onto something. So that's one of those difficulties, but also what I think makes more interesting about social sciences versus many other what we call physical sciences. Okay, but let's get back to this. Let's get back to our current experiment. So the hypothesis that physically attractive people should at least be rated as better smelling than unattractive people, sort of testing this very basic notion of our theory. So again, operationally defining these things, we could take a really easy route and just survey people. Lots of studies do this. And probably it's not a bad way of doing it, because being physically attractive or smelling good is a very subjective thing. So you're just acting to people subjectively. For example, how physically attractive is this person? So we could just, have them rated on a scale of 1 to 10. Similar with smelling, how good does this person smell? Again, on a level from 1 to 10. So in this way, we could choose really easy operational definitions. We could make it more or less complex by trying to use machinery or brain scans or whatever, but let's keep this simple for now. So in our experimental design, again, we like to draw these sort of things out. In this case, our independent variable is attractiveness. So what we can do is have participants look at a bunch of pictures of other participants and rate them as, how attractive are they on a scale of 1 to 10, and then divide those into two groups. So those who get rated really low on a 1 to 3 out of 10, those we will put in our unattractive group. These will be our unattractive pool of participants. Those who are high attractiveness are voted 7 to 10. Those are going to be our high attractive participants. And then we'll have other participants come in and smell them. So, what is the average smell of these individuals low in attractiveness versus the smell of these in high attractiveness? So that would be our dependent variable. So again, the way we're drawing this out, our independent variable is we're going to split participants into two groups, those who basically smell others who are of low attractiveness, and those who smell others of high attractiveness. This will be our two groups, or independent variable. And then we have a dependent variable, how good or bad do these individuals actually smell? So that's one way of looking at this, the IVs and DVs. Another way is to look at, because we have our IV, in this independent variable of attractiveness, we have two levels. Those are of high or low attractiveness. And then we have our values, how good or bad they smell. That's our dependent variable. In this case, there are no cells because there aren't multiple independent variables. Maybe if we looked at the effect of attractiveness and gender on smell, then we could have cells. In that case, we'd have two levels of attractiveness, two types of gender, so we'd have 4 cells. Okay, so then we want to conduct our experiment. So in this case, we need participants, but also confederates. So confederates are basically people who act in the experiment, but those that we aren't measuring in terms of the dependent variable. So oftentimes they're actors who maybe play out a scenario in the experiment to see how people react. In this case, we're just looking for people who others will smell. So let's say we recruit 100 undergrads, and we select, we do a little pilot testing. We select those that are rated as the most attractive, so the 20 most attractive confederates or undergrads that we get. And then we select the 20 least attractive undergrads. Of course, we wouldn't tell them which group they belong to. We basically just get pictures of them, have them rated, and then we as researchers would know who's the attractive or unattractive camp. And then we need to, of course, develop a measure of smell. We could just call this a smell scale. So it could be something as simple as, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good does this person smell? 10 being very good, 1 being very bad. That could be as simple as it needs to be. So then we would have to develop a procedure. So in this case, how do we have people smell other people? Well, it would probably be pretty awkward if we had people just stand there while participants smell them. It would also not be very unbiased. Because one thing that could happen is if you go up to someone who looks really good, you might have the expectation that they're going to smell good, and that might actually bias the way that they perceive that person to smell. Actually, smell is something that can be easily biased. For example, if you have someone close up their nose and you tell them that they're going to eat apple, and in fact you give them an onion, they usually can't tell the difference. And actually, in fact, they'll taste apple. Similarly, if you have a little container of water and you tell them that it's going to be smelling like vanilla and you open it, oftentimes people will smell vanilla, even though the scent of vanilla isn't actually there. So we want to make sure people are as unbiased as possible in what they're smelling. So to do that, what we could do, and this is, believe it or not, what a lot of researchers have done, is we could have all of our confederates, in this case, the attractive and unattractive confederates, wear a shirt. Just wear it all day to sort of collect their natural scent. Of course, they'd have to be wearing non-scented deodorant, so that doesn't bias their smell. And we'd, of course, have every confederate wear the exact same type of non-scented deodorant. We could even include instructions like, don't smoke that day, don't eat strong foods like curry or onions or garlic, so that it would control for all of those extraneous variables. And then we could seal their shirt in a plastic bag, preserve that wonderful or not so wonderful smell. And then, part 2, have people smell their shirts. And oftentimes, psychologists and experimenters won't have them smell the physical thing that they sweated into. Oftentimes, they'll take a sample from it, so take a little bit of air from the bag, and then have people smell that, just so that they aren't so grossed out by it. But in this case, we could have them just smell the shirt itself. So in this case, we're doing our best not to bias participants because the participant doesn't know what the person who wore their shirt looked like. All they can tell is how good or bad the shirt smells. And of course, they would rate each shirt on the smell scale. So let's say we did this. And here are results I made up, but they actually reflect results that are pretty close to reality when people do this type of research. That in fact, attractive people do tend to smell a little better than unattractive people. So in this case, that's our smell scale with people who are rated unattractive or, on a scale of 1 to 10, get rated 1 to 3. They tend to have an average rating of about 4.3, so a little bit below the median value of 5 in smelling. So it smells a little raunchy. And those who are attractive, actually, hey, they smell pretty good, almost a full 1.5 points above, again, the median part of that scale. So we could also graph that like this. So in terms of pleasant odor on a scale of 1 to 10, no one's coming out smelling 10 out of 10, oh, I smell great. But definitely the people who are higher in attractiveness are smelling a bit better. So in this case, we've followed the steps of science pretty well. We've had the induction part of making observations, maybe just everyday life, that attractive people seem to smell better. We made a theory out of that. We tested out that theory by saying, well, if this theory is true, then at least people who are more attractive should smell better than people who are less attractive. That's a very basic part of that theory. So we examined that. We collected participants, we made materials, we operationally defined our variables and measured them. We created a procedure that would try to be as unbiased as possible. And then you examine the results. Is our hypothesis correct? In this case, it was. In fact, and this is based on some real science, that attractive people do tend to smell better than unattractive people, even if you can't see them, if you're just basing that on purely their smell. And so in this case, the job isn't done. What we'd have to do is go back and go, okay, our theory has gained a little bit of support, but there are other parts of this theory we need to test out. So for example, we never tested out the whole part of the theory that what underlies this good smell is actually good genes or healthy genes. So we'd have to create other predictions from that we could then test more directly. So oftentimes from this, we're going to generate additional hypotheses to test. And we won't go through these individually, but just to give you an idea. For example, if it is good genes, basically we could measure other things that have to do with good genes, like good health, no physical abnormalities, symmetry of the body and face are all signs of good genetics. All of these should be predictive of a good smell, basically a pleasant odor, if our theory is correct. Of course, none of these findings individually would prove that it's good genes causing pleasant body odor, but they would all lend support to it. So if we tested all these out and they all proved to be correct, we'd have, again, more support for our theory. Maybe we could even extend it into ways that might be unexpected. So maybe we have someone who's very attractive wear a shirt and then give it to someone who is of mediocre attractiveness, so someone who'd be a 5 out of 10. Does suddenly the smell of the attractive person on their shirt make that other individual seem more attractive to participants? This could be sort of an interesting, unexpected effect of good genes being transferred or signaled by good smell. So that's one way in which we could go about testing out our theory, is creating more predictions, more hypotheses, and testing those out one by one. Another interesting way of doing it, this is one that psychologists sometimes ignore because it can be a little bit more difficult, and oftentimes psychologists maybe don't want to refute the theory. But a good way to test the theory is trying to directly refute it. Can we find evidence that totally disproves this theory? So for example, let's say that we think it's good genes that are causing people to smell good, but maybe it's just healthiness, just general healthiness, not having any diseases or abnormalities. Maybe that just makes people smell better. Maybe it's that people who have bad genes, maybe they're sick more often and having the flu, having a cold, whatever, having an infection causes people to smell worse. So in this case, we could develop the competing hypothesis. It's not good genes that cause people to smell good. It's just the fact that healthy people smell better than sick people. So in this way, we could run an experiment where we do just that. We have people in a healthy group and then people who are in a sick group, people who have some type of illness, flu, infection. Of course, we want to do something to safeguard participants from that infectious disease. So maybe we could do something like superheating their shirts to kill any bacteria, viruses on them, or disinfecting them, but otherwise preserving their smell. And then again, have participants smell them. And if indeed we find that it's just that healthy people smell better than sick people, well, then we'd have to maybe question our theory a bit. Maybe it's not so much the genes, but just general health. Another aspect could be that being on a healthy diet just makes people smell better. So in this case, we could put people, this is a really good one, we could actually manipulate this independent variable. We could put Confederates on either a healthy or a poor diet for 30 days, and then of course collect that smell sample and have other people smell it. And if again we find that people in the healthy diet condition indeed smell better than in the non-healthy diet condition, we could probably rule that that is indeed an important factor. So maybe again it's not good genes that are an important factor, maybe it's this other thing. So this is something that, again, psychologists probably don't do enough of. I think it's a really interesting way to test theories, is to actually create counter or competing hypotheses and test those. Now, if both of these hypotheses turned out to be false, then we sort of ruled out that it is just good health and good diet that cause people to smell good, and that actually, in a way, supports our original theory that maybe it's something deeper like good genes. So theories, of course, people can have any kind of theory they want, but good theories are ones that get tested repeatedly with many hypotheses and continually come out to be supported. So oftentimes theories get slammed in the news media by, it's very often where you'll hear this with arguments by creationists or people behind intelligent design, that evolution, the thing that they're against, is just a theory. Well, that's true. It is a theory. But saying just a theory is a bit too diminutive because it's a theory that it turns out to be a very, very good theory. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that the theory of evolution, a lot of good theories, are ones that just don't seem to be able to be falsified. Now, falsified is sort of one of those fancy words that we're going to come back to again and again. It basically just means that it's never been refuted. It's never been shown outright to be false. And many people have tried to prove the theory of evolution to be false. No one has been successful yet. So in that way, it's a good theory in that it stood the test of time. It stood the test of many different testing phases and many different hypotheses. Also, another hallmark of a good theory is that it can explain a lot of things. It has good explanatory power. So that is one of the really great things about evolution, is that it can explain not only how polar bears develop their white coats, or how cows develop their four stomachs. It can explain in almost any type of biological finding that a species shares in common, or how species change over time, or how environments affect species, or how we find species who may have been reared separately but in similar environments coming out with the same types of traits, even though they didn't ever share genetics. So evolution is one of those theories that not only has been tested and supported many, many, many times, but it also has really huge explanatory power. It can explain tons of things with a very simple explanation. Basically that animals genetically change to fit their environment. So another aspect of a good theory is that it should be able to reliably make good predictions. This is just in terms of creating lots of hypotheses that turn out to be true. Not just true, but very, very accurately true. So actually coming back to this case that we're talking about, maybe we could even find that people with good genes smell better than people with bad genes regardless of their diet, regardless of their health. Maybe people with good genes smell good even when they're sick with the flu, even when they've been eating nothing but McDonald's for 30 days. If we could show that, then we could actually find that that theory really is powerful, much more powerful than competing theories. So in that way, again, a good theory is one that gets tested a lot, gets supported a lot, can explain a lot of things, and can even make predictions that are unexpected but turn out to be true. So that's, of course, all what if our hypothesis turns out to be correct, ways of building upon it, building upon the theory, testing it further, all that kind of stuff. What if our hypothesis turns out to not be correct? Well, in that case, we have to create a new theory. We go, okay, well, we still have these observations to deal with. What's a different way of explaining them that we could test? And oftentimes people will refute a theory, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to scrap the whole theory. Maybe the test wasn't done correctly, or things weren't operationally defined correctly. Oftentimes other scientists will come along and try to test things in different ways to see, well, is the theory really wrong, or is just the way that it was tested was inaccurate or biased in some way? But if it turns out, convincingly that a theory is wrong, then yes, you go back to the drawing board and you create new theories. That's something that science is actually very good at, is sort of not supporting something just because they want to, but because the evidence points in that direction. So just as another example, we'll go through this one a little more quickly because hopefully you guys are sort of getting the hang of this, but I just had an everyday observation that I like to sort of think about theoretically. So this is one, I don't know if there's a lot of research on this, I haven't really looked into it, but one observation I made just having a dog and going to different dog parks is that dog parks are often segregated in terms of little dogs versus big dogs. And I actually have a medium-sized dog. She's like right in the middle between the two, so oftentimes I'll spend some time in both, depending on how many dogs are there. But one thing I've noticed again and again is that people in the big dog section, and here I'm talking about the people, not the dogs, tend to be pretty active. So they tend to be walking around, running with their dog, playing with their dog, whereas those who are on the little dog side, here on the bottom picture, tend to be relatively inactive. They tend to just sort of sit around a bit, talk, while their dogs play on their own. So that's just an observation I made, and you can come up with many different theoretical expectations about it. So one that I made maybe is that people, and it could be competing theories. Let's say we do two theories here. So one theory could be that people who are inactive, I don't want to say lazy, but people who are inactive, like to relax, get little dogs because those dogs don't require as much exercise. So that could be one of my theories. So one way I could test this, I'm sort of doing this off the cuff, but maybe one prediction you could do is have record people's activity levels for a number of days. A month would be probably a good estimate of people's relative activity levels, and then have them go to a animal shelter, a dog shelter, and then have them say, on a level 1 to 10, how much would you want to adopt each of these dogs? And see, well, do inactive people actually want smaller dogs? Is that what they prefer? Maybe even ask them why and see, does anyone say, well, I want a small dog because they don't require as much exercise? So that could be one hypothesis that I could test out. So in that case, I need to get a group of people, hopefully with a lot of variance in activity levels, a lot of people who are high activity, a lot of people who are low activity. I could create measures that could be as simple as on a scale of 1 to 10, how much would you want to adopt this dog? And then develop a procedure where I have them walk through the shelter and all get exposed to the same dogs in the same environment in the same way, and see if there's a reliable difference between this active and inactive group and what type of dogs they'd prefer. So again, if that hypothesis is correct, I could come at it and try to create new hypotheses from this. So let's say a different way to test this would be to maybe, well, let's say manipulate someone's activity level. So it's true that if you make someone active for a period of time, that tends to become the norm. So maybe I could get a group of relatively lazy people and have them, choose what type of dogs they would like, and then make them active for, usually takes about 3 to 6 months to make something into a habit. So to make them exercise, maybe by offering them incentives for 3 to 6 months, making sure that even after the incentives are not in place anymore, that they keep exercising. So in fact, I've made a group of inactive people active, and then see if their preferences in dogs change over time. So for example, that could be another way to test the hypothesis. But let's say that our hypothesis turns out to be totally incorrect, that we find no average preference difference in people who are active or inactive. Then maybe I would have to come up with a new theory. Maybe it's not that, it's the people selecting dogs to fit their life or their activity levels. Maybe the dogs dictate how active their owners are. So a totally different theory. Let's say that people who get big dogs just suddenly learn that they have to be more active to entertain and keep control of, make sure their dog is behaving well. So maybe it's that if you have a bigger dog, of course you're in the bigger dog section, and you just have to, because of the dog's energy level, be up in playing with them and attending to them more. So in that case, that would actually be a very easy hypothesis to test. You could literally just give people, randomly assign them to have a big dog or a little dog, and see how they interact with them for, let's say, a few weeks or a month. Now, if we find that by giving someone a big dog, we increase their activity level, increase the amount that they're in the dog park playing and monitoring the dog and all that stuff very actively, then indeed we'd find support for the theory that it's the dog's activity level that's actually affecting the owner's activity level. So again, you can come up with different theories, you can test them in different ways, but you want to find the theory that receives the most support. Okay, so that's sort of a general overview of the research steps, the things that all scientists do, including psychologists. But another important thing to consider is what type of results do people get and how do people display those results. So here we're going to go over, I believe it's three basic types of results. Of course, we're going to get into these more as the semester goes on, but 3 basic types of results that we're going to come back to again and again and again. So one of the big ones, and probably one of the most common ones that we find in psychology, are results having to do with differences. So like we were saying at the very beginning of the video, these could be differences on an individual level, differences on a group level, or differences in conditions. We could have, a really simple experiment is have a condition where people are receiving some type of medication, like an antidepressant, and another condition where they're receiving a placebo, a pill that they think may or may not be medication, but in fact contains no medication. So in this case, we'd be looking for a difference between those two conditions. Similarly, in this vein, we could do a study where we look at the effect of caffeine on exam performance. So we could give one group caffeinated sodas and the other group non-caffeinated sodas. Of course, we wouldn't want to tell them which soda they'd have because that might bias their performance. But then we would split them into those two groups and measure their performance. An interesting finding I found in the research literature not too long ago, and it's a good example of difference type of result, is basically what they were looking at, the DV in this case, was how much sex were people having, or how many sexual partners were people having. And they actually found a significant result, or significant differences between iPhone, BlackBerry, and Android users. So here are the results in that, and this, I think, is a good illustration of how best to display difference results, which is in a bar graph. And here you can clearly see that those with an iPhone had more sexual partners on average. In fact, women with iPhones averaged about 12 sexual partners by the age of 30, where men averaged about 10 sexual partners by the age of 30. This is controlled for age, by the way, because these are all measures at the age of 30. And then BlackBerry and Android users were significantly less. So in this case, a kind of interesting finding. It doesn't explain why this finding came out to be, but nonetheless, it's kind of interesting. And again, I wanted to illustrate that the best way to display this type of result is in a bar graph. So we're going to be seeing lots of bar graphs where we sort of split groups into different bars and then measure them or display their values in terms of the DV alongside of each other. Really quick and easy way to see if there are any group differences. Another type of main research finding are relationships. So in this case, we're not interested in group differences, but rather the relationship between two variables. For example, we could look at something as simple as how quickly someone talks and how intelligent they're perceived to be. So is the relationship between not what someone's saying, but just how quickly they're saying it and how intelligent they sound. And we can measure any two variables. So one that's really interesting, I think, I like research on art and aesthetics. Researchers looked at how many colors are in a painting or on a wall or anything like that, and how attractive it's perceived to be. And in fact, there is even a relationship there. So in this case, we're not going to display these relationships in terms of a bar graph. That really wouldn't make sense. So we often display them in terms of what we call a scatter plot graph. So let me explain these with a couple of examples. So that first example, this is one of a positive relationship. We'll talk about what that means in a second. But this is an example of the relationship between the rate of speech, or how fast someone is talking, and their perceived intelligence. So in this case, this is a positive relationship because I'll go and look at my mouse here. So as we start with lower rates of speech, so down here on the y-axis or the vertical axis, we find that people are of a lower perceived intelligence. So here we have, on the lower end of the x-axis, or the horizontal axis of perceived intelligence. But then as we rise in the rate of speech, so as people are talking faster and faster and faster, they tend to be perceived as more and more intelligent. That's why we get this nice, very evident pattern in the dots. So each of these dots represents maybe one person. So this person's talking very slow, also perceived as not being very intelligent, whereas this person's talking very fast and perceived as being relatively more intelligent than this person. So we aggregate or look at all these individuals in one graph, and we can see a very clear pattern. So we call this a positive relationship because as you go up in one variable, in this case rate of speech, you also go up in the other variable, or perceived intelligence. So, and this is in fact true. This is based on real research that regardless of what you're saying, the faster you say it, the more people perceive you as being intelligent. It doesn't necessarily mean you should talk fast all the time, because there's actually excuse me, a reverse relationship between how fast you talk and how much people actually understand what you're saying. So it's sort of this interesting thing where if you talk really fast, people think you're smart, but they don't understand or remember all that much of what you say. So I try to talk more in a medium, speed in my own lectures. Sometimes I'm definitely guilty of talking a little too fast. Okay, so a negative relationship is the opposite, of course. A good example is the classic bystander effect, hopefully something you've heard about maybe in Psych 1 classes or social psych. This is where if someone needs help, the more people who are around to help them, the less they're actually likely to get helped. So if someone collapses on a street and only one other person sees them, that one other person usually feels responsible and calls 911 and tries to help them. But lots of studies have shown that if someone collapses or needs help in a really busy street or in a really busy building or classroom, oftentimes people will just sort of look and go, well, hopefully someone else will help them. All these other people around, so someone else will definitely help them. I don't personally need to help them. And then it turns out that nobody ends up helping them. So in this case, it's a negative relationship because the bigger the crowd size, so here on this part of the y-axis, you have large crowds, on here very small crowds, maybe 1 or 2 people versus hundreds of people. And here we have helping behavior. If they're in a really large crowd, we see very little helping behavior, so really far down here on the x-axis. Whereas if there's not many people around at all, so they're really low on crowd size, we see really high helping behavior. So, higher prevalence of help here on the x-axis. So in this case, it's negative because the higher you go up in something, in this case crowd size, the lower you are in the other thing, in this case helping behavior. And so the positive, negative, it's easy to see in the graph. If it's a negative relationship, the higher you are on the y-axis, the lower it is on the x-axis, so it creates this upper left to bottom right pattern. Whereas in positive relationships, the higher you are in one, the higher you are in the other, so it creates this pattern from bottom left to top right. So a little bit more of a complex relationship, or what we call curvilinear relationships, and this is when the pattern is curved. In other words, it can create, maybe a U-shaped curve like this, or an upside down U. Sometimes they can even create sort of a wave pattern, although that's kind of rarer. I tried to find an example of a curvilinear relationship. They're somewhat rare, but this was an interesting one where the number of colors in a painting or on a cup or a t-shirt or anything, the more colors you have becomes more aesthetically pleasing up to a certain point, and then if you get too many colors, it starts to become less aesthetically pleasing. So, going from something that's very basic, maybe something with 3 colors, really low on the color scale, tends to be seen as somewhat lower in attractiveness. Then you get more and more colors, you get higher and higher in attractiveness, so something like this is very pleasant to us. And then if you get too many colors, too much complexity, it just sort of looks like someone, threw up on the canvas, so to speak, or just spread paint everywhere. Then it starts to become less and less attractive. So this is an interesting example of it goes up and up and up to a certain point, and then it starts to change direction, go down. It creates this curve or curvilinear pattern. We're not going to see this a lot in this class because it tends to be rarer in psychological findings to find U-shaped or reverse U-shaped curves like this, but I wanted to throw you this as an example of something that you could find. And then the last type, and one that definitely doesn't come up a lot in research because we tend to find it as less than interesting, and thus doesn't tend to get written about as much, are null relationship, or basically just no relationships, sometimes called zero correlations. And this is when there is just simply no relationship between one variable or another. So again, I had a hard time finding an interesting version of this. One example is that, and this is kind of a surprising one, that there's no relationship whatsoever between intelligence and creativity. So when they look at people who are really highly intelligent versus people who are of medium or low intelligence, they find no average differences in creativity there. So that's kind of a surprising one. One I thought was really interesting, I found a good graph for it, is trying to predict stock outcomes. So not necessarily has to do with psychology, but it's an interesting finding nonetheless, is that if you look at the performance of a stock in its first 5 years and then you try to predict the performance of it in the next 5 years, you find no relationship whatsoever. It's one of those things that makes the stock market very difficult to predict, is that how good a stock is doing at any one point in time is not at all related to how well it's going to do in the future. So interesting one, you could tell it's a null relationship or a zero correlation because all the dots are just randomly scattered about. So a stock that did really poorly in one 5 year block is just as likely to do poorly as a stock who did really well in a 5-year block and yet did really poorly on the next 5 years. So it's all scattered equally around here, so the past, in this case, not at all predictive of the future in terms of stock values. So in terms of correlation, we usually talk about correlation in terms of R values. Excuse me. So an R value is just a number ranging anywhere from -1 to +1, the medium, of course, being a perfect 0, that typifies how strong and in what direction a relationship is. So in this case, let's say we're dealing with an R of +0.37. So right here we can tell just by the number itself that the relationship we're talking about is a positive one because the number itself is positive. And here, since it's positive, it can only range from a 0 to a +1. In this case, it's pretty close to 0. So it's, less than the halfway point, which would be 0.5. So we'd say that's probably a pretty weak relationship. So with each number that you get in terms of an R value, and usually you'll find this in correlational research, just by looking at the R value itself, it instantly tells you whether a relationship is positive or negative, and in general, how strong that relationship is. So just to give you some examples, if we had an R of 0.5, the scatter plot would look something like this. So clearly we can see a positive pattern between these two. So actually R of 0.05 is about the relationship between height and weight. So they're definitely related. You know, taller people, this could be y-axis, could be tallness, this could be weight. So taller people do tend to weigh more. But there are lots of people who are tall but very skinny, or short but overweight. And so the correlation isn't perfect. It's not a perfect positive one. It's just what we call sort of a moderate relation of 0.5. If we got to a relationship like this of about 0.9, this is, in fact, a very strong positive relationship. It's very hard to find relationships this strong in nature. I'm trying to think of an example. Gosh, it is a really, really difficult one. Let's say that here's probably, I'm guessing, a strong relationship is the number of cone receptors you have to how good your color perception is. So this is, the graph wouldn't look exactly like this because you basically have 3 groups, people without, or maybe 4 groups, people without any color receptors, no cones, people with 1 type of cone cell, people with 2 types of cone cells, and people with 3 types of cone cells. So in this case, color perception would be very well matched or very well predicted by the number of cone receptors you have, because if you have 0, you can't perceive color at all. If you have 1 cone receptor, you can perceive basically just shades of, usually just kind of 1 or 2 colors. If you have 2 cone receptors, usually you have what we call red-green color blindness, where you can see a lot of colors, but not nearly as much as if you had all 3 working cone receptors. So I just tried to think of something where the IV, how many cone receptors you have, is really strongly related with the DV, in this case, color perception. But again, it's really rare to find something that strong in psychology. And then this is really hypothetical. We never have found this, you know, perfect 1-to-1 correlation. But just hypothetically, if you had a perfect 1 correlation, then every data point that you had would fall exactly on the predictive line. So of course we can have this in the negatives as well, just changing direction. So if something's a negative 0.5, it's the same type of coherence or pattern, it's just in the opposite direction. So let's see, something that's negatively related, well, actually a good one, it's apt to class or students, is that there is a negative correlation of about 0.5 in terms of attendance and exam performance. So if people, oh shoot, well that I guess would be more of a positive correlation. Let's say we flip it, we go absenteeism and exam performance. So the more you're absent from class, I could be on the y-axis, so these are the people who are really absent a lot, these are people who come to every class, the higher the exam performance. So people who, the people who are more absent tend to do worse on the exam. So they'd be right here. So they'd be doing really poorly on the exam, let's say 50% versus 100%, whereas people who aren't never absent, so they're on here, would be doing really good on the exams. So that'd be a negative correlation of about 0.5. Of course, you can get people who never come to class and do really well. You can get people who come to every class and do poorly. They're just not as likely. So that makes it, not a perfect negative correlation, but there's definitely a pattern that goes on there. Most of the time, absenteeism negatively predicts exam performance. And of course, we can have null findings here. Again, just random dispersal of dots, 0 correlation. This is just to illustrate that if there's no pattern whatsoever, you're going to have a correlation of 0, very close to 0. And then the more you get to a relationship or some type of coherent pattern, the closer you're going to get either to -1 in cases of a negative relationship, or to +1 in terms of a positive relationship. So again, if I give you an R value of, let's say, negative, let's say 0.8, then you could say, well, it's a negative relationship because the number is negative, and that's pretty dang close to 1, so it's a strong negative relationship versus a correlation of 0.1, positive correlation, but a very weak correlation because it's very close to 0. Okay, so the last type of research result I'm going to talk about here are interactions, and these are the most complex type of result. So we're not going to talk a lot about interactions until we get to the very end of the semester, but I just wanted to get a little bit into what interactions are and how to graph them so they won't, come as a total surprise when we get to them. So an interaction is when we have more than one independent variable affecting a dependent variable. So we're looking at a combination of factors affecting our DV. So in this case, this is best illustrated with a line graph, and let me show you why. So a line graph very easily shows you multiple groups in their relationship with one another. So I tried to find a result that was easy enough to understand, one that would be applicable to you guys, but also one that is an interaction between 2 variables. And I found some interesting research on the effect of parental pressure or parental involvement on academic success. So right here, I'm typifying academic success in terms of, let's say, their grade in the class, so anywhere from 60, 50, 60% not good, all the way up to close to 100% being very good. So what they found is that the effect of parental pressure, parental involvement, actually depends on the age of students in terms of how much it spurns or deters success. So a lot of research has found that for younger students, so elementary students, and right here I just typify that as around age 10, that having more parental pressure equals higher success. So here, this is, not exactly test or study results. This is just something I created, but it mimics actual findings that people or kids with very low parental pressure, low parental involvement tend to not do that well in school, whereas the higher the pressure involvement gets, the better they do in school. This is for a lot of reasons, probably because kids of this age would genuinely just forget to do what they need to do to be successful. So they'd forget to do their homework unless their parents are sort of on top of them. They might not understand things that their parents can easily explain to them, like lower level mathematics and science. And so they really benefit from that parental involvement, pressure, all that kind of stuff. Whereas other research has found that when we look at high schoolers and college students, we tend to find the exact opposite pattern, that higher levels of parental pressure might actually deter, in a lot of cases, academic success. So in this case, oftentimes with teenagers and with young adults, their academic success, they kind of don't need parental involvement to be successful because they know how to do their homework, they know to remember to do their homework, and oftentimes if they're seeking advice from their parents, they're seeking advice on things that are oftentimes more complex than their parents can really answer. Maybe it's, higher level calculus or something that their parents haven't done in a long time, and so their parents' involvement wouldn't be that beneficial. In this case, high parental pressure wouldn't be that beneficial, but low parental pressure wouldn't be that detrimental because they wouldn't get that much out of having parents be involved. But high parental pressure tends to be detrimental because it can cause a lot of reactance, especially in teenagers. Whereas if their parent is always on top of them about doing their homework, school, success, that can be very aggravating and actually cause students to succeed less, sometimes in reactance to their parents and they sort of wanting to make their parents angry, sometimes just because it makes them sort of disenfranchised and less excited to be in school and learning. So in this case, usually it's not this sharp of an effect. It's not like parental pressure is going to turn a B student into an F student, but just sort of want to show you this. That's oftentimes parental pressure can have a negative effect on academic success in college students, but a positive effect on elementary students. So this is one of the more interesting types of research, or interaction studies, because you can find the effect of one thing, like parental pressure, on the DV, in this case academic success, can totally depend on another variable, like the student's age. So this gets to be, looking at more complex theories, more complex results, and so it needs a line graph to really show you these differences and how one variable can affect another in bringing about very different effects on the dependent variable. So again, it gets a little more complicated, but we'll sort of save this more toward the end of the semester. Now I want to talk a little bit about some different types of studies that we're going to be getting into a lot more as the semester goes on. So we're going to start out here with non-experimental types of studies, which most often look at behavior that occurs naturally. This can, it's most often done in the field. This can be done in public places. It can also be done in businesses, anywhere where people consent to be studied. One of the more interesting versions of this is looking at just individual cases. So sometimes due to circumstance, disease, brain abnormalities, certain individuals can come along that are really interesting to investigate. One of the most famous ones, of course, is this guy. It's a little gross, but we all know the story of Phineas Gage. Poor guy got his head spiked through with a railroad spike, and it took out a significant portion of his frontal lobes. What was so interesting about this is that at the time, in the, I believe, late 1800s, when we didn't know much about the frontal lobes, we had really no idea what they were used for, and it took an extreme case like this for us to figure out what exactly they do, that they're in charge of things like behavioral inhibition, personality, thinking and planning for the future, all that kind of stuff. And we really only figured that out at first by having a case like this come along and study how he changed before and after his accident. So lots of cases in the literature on interesting case studies. Later on we might talk about the case of Jeannie, which was a girl who was basically left to her own, socially isolated for the first 13 years of her life, which is, again, a lot of these are very unfortunate cases, but interesting cases psychologically. How does someone progress and learn and develop emotionally and socially with such high amounts of neglect or with such specific types of brain damage can make for some really interesting case studies. So that's one. It doesn't tend to come up a lot in modern research, but once in a while an interesting case presents itself that is really illuminating research-wise. So much more common under this umbrella are naturalistic observation studies, and this is observing people in their natural habitat and natural settings. I tried to pick an interesting one here, and I think I did recently, and actually they do this every once in a few years. The American Society for Microbiology tests whether people actually wash their hands in the restroom. So they do this in a very covert way, because obviously if you just ask people whether they wash their hands, and in fact they did this, they find in surveys, vast majority of adults, no surprise, say they wash their hands every time they go to the bathroom. So this is one of those things where people will obviously lie, because it's not seen as such a good thing to say that you don't wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. In fact, I'm surprised that even 4% of people said, hey, you know what, I don't care, I don't wash my hands, don't worry about it. So most people obey at least the social convention to say they wash their hands. But what they do is they have experimenters hide in stalls. They put in a little out of order sign in front of the stall, and then they listen. And they listen for bathroom activity, number of times people wash their hands, and they calculate at the end of the day how many people went to the bathroom, how many times the faucets were on and off, and how many people actually wash their hands or not. And now they can even do this electronically by electronically recording like when people are using the restroom and how often the hand washing machines are turned on. So in actuality, things aren't as bad as you might expect. Vast majority of women do in fact wash their hands when they covertly observe them. Only about 3% of women lied about it. But boy, the guys, not so good. Only about 3/4 of the guys actually wash their hands in these nationally representative studies. So a lot more lying guys than when it comes to women. Of course, this is in the US, and we're actually a lot better in the US than in most parts of the world. They did a similar study in London a year prior and found that only 2/3 of women and only about 1/3 of men wash their hands in public restrooms in London. So if you're going overseas, just be aware of that. So that's an interesting type of experiment where you can really catch people in real behavior, which is, I think, fascinating for social scientists, because we're often worried about people lying or misrepresenting themselves. And that's sort of the key point to this next part, or this next type of experiment, the survey, because it is really prone to lying, and not just misrepresentation, like a conscious misrepresentation, but even unconscious misrepresentation. People not really knowing how to answer questions or how to honestly answer questions. But it's still one of the easiest, cheapest, and sometimes best ways to get at information, is just to ask people about it. So oftentimes it's the only way to get at things that are happening internally. So thoughts, feelings, past experiences that weren't directly recorded, that sort of thing. But we're going to get into sort of some of the problems with this here, with this example. So in the 1970s, one research, and this became a very famous study, found that there was a high correlation between self-esteem and grades in African-American children. So this was an interesting finding, because he was trying to figure out why African-American children underperformed in schools. And he found that actually those who had high self-esteem, so sort of a good self-view, did really well in school. So this was an interesting finding. He sort of jumped the gun, and a lot of other researchers jumped the gun in trying to posit that this meant that if you increase kids' self-esteem, it increases their grades. But this is not necessarily the case, and this is what can often plague survey research, is this question of causality. So it could be that raising kids' self-esteem could cause them to have higher grades. It could also be that just having higher grades raises self-esteem, sort of a reverse causality. Could also be that there's lots of third factors, maybe having good parents, having an affluent background, having types of friends who uplift you and who provide positive role models might provide both good self-esteem and good grades. So this is what we call the third variable problem. This is when any number of extraneous variables, remember we just talked about those variables that affect the DV that we might not even be aware of, are causing relationships that we see. So in this case, there are many third variable problems. So there could be basically good background, so good parenting, good schools, more affluence, more wealth. Also just higher confidence. Maybe there's something to do with actually working on your self-esteem, but more in a confidence sphere of self-efficacy beliefs, and having a better work ethic that causes both high self-evaluations and better work performance. It could even be something related with genes. Believe it or not, self-esteem is about 50% attributable to heritability, meaning that genes account for about 50% of variability in self-esteem. And we know that genes count for a lot more of that, a lot more variability when it comes to intelligence, more around 80 to 90%. So there could just be a genetic link there between high self-esteem and intelligence. So one of the problems with doing surveys, but also a lot of non-experimental work, is just if you can't isolate variables, if you can't control for them like you can in experiments, which we'll talk about here in a bit, it's really hard to rule out extraneous variables as the causes of relationships or group differences. And sometimes things can be causally related, but in a way that you didn't think. So this whole third variable problem, this is why we always say in psychology, do not confuse correlation with causation. Basically what it's meaning is just because you found that two things were related to each other, that there's a correlation, doesn't necessarily mean that one is causing the other, or at least not in the way that you think they are. We often call this spurious relationships. This is when the relationship between two variables is actually caused by some unknown, unaccounted for third variable. And there's many, many examples of this. You can especially find it if you look for coverage of science in the news media, because often the news media it tends to be very bad about confusing correlation with causation. They'll have some tentative finding that two things are related, and the news media says, well, this must mean that A causes B, when that's often just not the case. In fact, this whole claim that high self-esteem causes academic success, we later found out in the 80s and 90s, is simply not true. If you increase people's self-esteem, they don't do any better in school or at work. In fact, they can sometimes get worse. They can become narcissistic and thus think they don't need to prepare as much for school because, hey, I'm so great, why do I need to study? And that can actually drive down performance. So sometimes they can turn out to be the exact opposite of what you initially think it is. But there were some interesting ones in the news media lately. One article that came out a year or two ago simply said that having more books in the home helps children go to school. So this, of course, came from a correlational study and actually a survey study to boot that just showed that people who had more books in the home, their kids ended up being more likely to go to school. But obviously there's many different reasons that could explain that finding. Probably the fact that there's more books in the home indicates that the parents are more educated, that they think reading is important, that they're probably more involved in their child's learning. And all of these factors are much more likely to be related to a kid going to school than just merely having books in the home. You hear a lot of times about correlational studies about, where you live affects you. So it's common to find articles about how living in New York, or there's a few other states lumped in here, New Jersey, Connecticut, can raise your general anxiety level. This simply comes from the fact that there's more cases of generalized anxiety diagnosed in New York than in other parts of the country. Well, that kind of makes sense when you consider the fact that there's more psychiatrists in New York than in any other part of the country. So more opportunity for diagnosis. It could also be that people who are more anxious, more driven, because often anxiety is related with higher work productivity, end up in high bustling places like New York. One that I particularly like, well, I'll show both of these, is having to do with prevention of Alzheimer's. So you hear about this all the time. If you keep your brain active, it will lessen your chances of getting Alzheimer's. If you eat nothing but fish oil and kelp, you'll lessen your chances of Alzheimer's. And one that came along recently, which I really liked, if you use marijuana regularly, you're less likely to get Alzheimer's. Well, all of these studies come from mostly survey research, but all of them are correlational data. And in fact, in 2012, there was a big panel of Alzheimer's research authorities who looked at all of the research on Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's prevention, dementia prevention, and they concluded unequivocally that so far we know of nothing, no medication, no behavioral treatment, no intellectual therapy, nothing, no food, no diet, no exercise that actually prevents Alzheimer's. All of the research that you read about in the news that comes up almost every week, you hear about some new thing that's supposed to stave off Alzheimer's or dementia, because it is something that a lot of people are afraid of. All of that's based on correlational research, usually not very good research anyway, not big samples, not very representative samples. But so far, whenever they've done a controlled clinical trial of a substance like vitamin E and different medications and diets and exercises, even intellectual exercises, they've never been shown to have any effect on Alzheimer's whatsoever. So it's one of those things where you really got to figure out where information is coming from, even if it seems legit and it's frequently cited in newspapers. Sometimes that doesn't really mean anything more than something's correlated. Okay, so that's a big caveat there of why non-experimental studies aren't the greatest thing in the world, because oftentimes they can confuse causation with correlation. So this is why experiments are oftentimes heralded as the sort of golden choice, so the hallmark of scientific inquiry, because it does a pretty good job, if you're doing it correctly, of controlling for extraneous variables. The big reason for this is when we conduct experiments, usually in a closed lab room where we have controlled everything in the environment, and where we can use tools like randomization, things we'll talk about, but especially experimental control, to just make sure that participants are all run through the exact same experiment, the exact same stimuli, manipulations, all that sort of stuff. And the one thing that differs between groups is the one thing that we directly manipulate. So, in a true experimentally controlled Alzheimer's study, and they've done many of these, is where they will randomly assign people, let's say, to an intellectual exercise, where they have to do 10 Sudoku puzzles a day. Half of them will be randomly subjected to that kind of game where they have to do 10 Sudoku puzzles in a row, and half of them won't have to do that. To be a really good control study, they'd have to do something else for the same amount of time. Maybe watch TV or read the newspaper or something like that, but something where they're, doing something where they're sitting down, relatively using their brain in the same way, just not using it intellectually. And then after a year or 2 years or however long the study takes, they then review who here has developed Alzheimer's, who's worsened in Alzheimer's. They then compare the groups that has been pretty equivocal except for that one independent variable. So that would be a true, experiment. Of course, most research on it just shows that people who naturally do Sudoku or whatever are less likely to get Alzheimer's or develop dementia, but they tend to be different from those who don't do that in any number of ways. There's no control there. So experimental control is the big key to an experiment. So if we can control for almost everything, or at least try to control for everything except for the one thing we're manipulating, then if we see any differences between groups at the end, so let's say the group that is doing Sudoku is less likely to develop Alzheimer's, it stands to reason that it was that one thing that caused the difference. That was the only difference between the groups, and the groups are different. That must be the reason why the groups are different. So that's the big thing with experiments, is that they can provide support for causation. Of course, no experiment is perfect, but if you run a series of experiments and they all come up the same way, then you can find more and more support for your hypothesis, and more support for causality or causal explanations in your hypothesis, which non-experimental methods can't do. So I tried to find an interesting version of an experiment that comes up with some pretty surprising findings, but because the experiment was done well, we kind of have to trust in those findings. And one I found that I thought was really interesting was one on the effect of black uniforms on unsportsmanlike behavior or bad behavior. So this follows the steps of science pretty well, in that the researchers made some general observations, in fact quantify those observations. So they said there does seem to be this general trend that sports teams that wear black uniforms tend to commit more penalties, be known for less sportsmanlike behavior. And in fact, they found that all 10 football and hockey teams that wore black uniforms showed much greater than average levels of aggression and unsportsmanlike behavior during games. So of course, like the Raiders being a popular example of that. More interestingly, they also found that if team went from a non-black uniform to a black uniform, even the year that they go to the black uniform and for years after, they display more aggressive behavior than they did before they had switched to the black uniform. That's a very interesting finding, because the first finding could well be explained that if a team is really aggressive, then the people who sort of decide on the team colors say, hey, let's do black, because that's sort of, we're known for being really aggressive, and that's sort of the colors that bad guys wear, and it has sort of this negative connotation, or at least aggressive, violent connotation in culture. The person dressed all in black is a person that shouldn't be trusted, because maybe they're trying not to be seen. But it's interesting that just changing the colors of the uniform then caused people to be more aggressive, or at least I say cause as in more the colloquial sense. There's no proof that it was caused there, because then that's not a controlled experiment, but still it hints that there might be a causal relation there. So they formalize a hypothesis that if you give people black uniforms, or you put them on the quote-unquote black team, or you make their team flag black, all these types of things, that will actually cause people to behave worse and more violently, more aggressively, because of the connotations in our media and in movies and whatnot of the black uniform or the man in black and all that kind of stuff. So it seems like kind of an outlandish thing that you can just put on a black uniform and be on the quote-unquote black team and suddenly you're going to start behaving worse. But they decided to run an experiment on it. So in this is a very simple experiment, which I'm sort of trying to give you some simple examples here, and then we'll get into some more complicated ones later on. But in this one, all they did was they had participants come in and they randomly assigned them to the white or black team. So right there, that's your independent variable. You get assigned to the white team or assigned to the black team. And then they asked participants what of two games they'd like to play. So one option that they had was a dart game. So it was a game of Nerf darts, which is considered a relatively violent game. At least it's very competitive, and it has the connotations of being violent because you have to point and shoot guns at each other, versus a non-violent game, so a game of putt-putt golf. So there was some pre-testing involved before this that showed that participants, different participants that are in this study, but participants in the pilot testing showed that both games were rated as equally fun, equally energetic. So they tried to pick two variants where really the only thing differing between them was the level of violence. So what they found was actually a very strong difference. That for participants who were selected to be on the white team, of course randomly selected, overwhelmingly picked the putt-putt golf game. Whereas those who were randomly selected to be on the black team overwhelmingly picked the violent game, the dart game. So it's an interesting effect. They didn't actually have them play the games. They didn't measure their aggression after that. They were just trying to see if just placing them on a white or black team would make them choose to play a more or less aggressive game. And in fact, they found that. So their hypothesis received support. So, one of the reasons why we can trust this finding, even though it seems a little crazy that that would have such effect, is because they used random assignment. So random assignment is a way to control for all participant factors. So participants, of course, when they come into a study, they may be different in any number of ways. So you're going to have participants that are naturally more aggressive than others. One of the biggest differences between participants here is you're going to have some who are men and some who are women. And a lot of research shows that men tend to be much more violent and aggressive than women, and indeed like more violent games, more violent video games, and the like. So what random assignment does, or randomly assigning participants as they come in to each of the conditions, what that does is they spread out equally all of these different participant variables. So let's say theoretically that you collected 100 participants and 20 of them happen to be really violent, naturally aggressive people, and 20 of them happen to be very passive individuals. Well, if you randomly assign them to each condition, what you're doing is you're pretty much guaranteeing that 10 of the 20 violent individuals are probably going to end up on one team and the other 10 on the other. And the same with the passive individuals. It's just like flipping a coin. If you flip a coin 20 times, it's really unlikely that all 20 times it's going to end up heads. So it's really unlikely that all 20 of those aggressive individuals are going to end up on one team, and it's really unlikely that all 20 of the passive individuals are going to end up on the other team. So in this way, random assignment guarantees that your experiment, at least in terms of participant variables, what types of participants are in each group, are balanced. That the same number of aggressive and passive people, or men and women, or social and introverted people, or whatever, are going to be relatively equal between the groups. That's a great thing about random assignment, is you don't even have to worry about the ways in which participants differ from each other, as long as you randomly assign each to the different groups. But let's say that just to sort of illustrate, why random assignment is a good thing, let's say that they didn't do that. Let's say that participants came in and they could decide whether or not to be on the white team or the black team. Well, if you did that, you could argue that, okay, the black team turned out to be more aggressive. Maybe that's just because naturally aggressive people were just more drawn to black colors. This could, anecdotally be seen in the world where you have, let me sort of think of an example where you go to the mall and then you have young men, usually, and if they're of the more violent persuasion, I'm trying not to be stereotypical here, but let's say, and not all people who are violent are this way, I will say that up front. But let's say, they do drugs, listen to rock metal music, they, love Insane Clown Posse. We'll just throw that in there. That seems apt. That they would probably be more likely, if you ask them, hey, do you want to be on the white team or the black team? They're likely to go, I want to be on the black team because black is death and that's like my soul and Insane Clown Posse is awesome. Let's bash heads. So you might then figure out, okay, well, the effect isn't showing that color changes people's attitudes or aggressiveness. It's just that people who are aggressive are more likely to be drawn to, darker colors, which is probably true. So in that case, you really couldn't rule out that as an alternative hypothesis. But the fact that each of them is randomly assigned, so you get just as many people who like the color black versus the color white assigned to the black team as to the white team, that rules out that possibility. So now it's only the effect of color on aggression that could be revealed, because the effect of how much you like color has no effect on what team you're placed on. It's just randomly assigned. And of course, same is true for men and women. So, actually, this next slide better illustrates that. So let's say if you have just a very small study where you just have 2 men and 2 women come in, then you could up with about 50% chance that both men will end up on one team and both women on another team. If that happens to be that both men end up on the black team and the black team turns out to be more aggressive, again, you haven't really shown much because it could just be that men are more aggressive. So this is why you have to have more than just a handful of people, even if you have just 20 people. So 10 men and 10 women come into an experiment. Suddenly, random assignment really works in your favor. So at this point, even with just 20 people, you have about a 0.1% chance, or 1 in 1,000 chance, that all the guys are going to be assigned to one team and all the women to another. So pretty good likelihood that even with just 20 people, this type of variable, men versus women, is going to be equally distributed between groups. And you can replace that just as easily with 10 aggressive people and 10 passive people. Still, it's very low likelihood that all of them are going to be found in one group versus another. They'll be most likely balanced. Now, in most studies, we tried to do more than that. So in the study that I talked about, they had about 100 people. So let's say that it was evenly split, 50 men, 50 women. In this case, the chances that the teams are going to be unbalanced, that there's going to be a lot more men on one team versus the other, is really astronomically low. So this is why they sort of say that the golden rule is about 30 participants per group. If you have about 30 participants per group, that controls for or balances out pretty much any participant factor that you can think of. Now, the only caveat to that is, let's say you have a study with 100 people and you have one very extreme individual. So let's say you're measuring aggression in terms of aggressive behavior, and you have someone come in who is really just sort of a serial killer in waiting, and they act extremely aggressively. In that case, you have what we call an outlier, and that can skew mean averages. That probably wouldn't skew it even that much if you had 50 people on each team, but if you had 30 on each team, it could, skew that in the terms of aggressiveness of whatever team they're on. We'll talk about outliers and their effects later on, but there are ways to control for that too. But in terms of normal everyday people, where most of them are falling somewhere in the average, randomization works perfectly well to balance out groups, to make sure that the only difference between the groups is what you're manipulating as the experimenter. Okay, so those are the really 2 important factors of why experiments are so beneficial in proving causality, or at least supporting causality. Experimental control, that you as the experimenter can control the environment, what people are exposed to, how they're exposed to it, what they do, and so you can make sure that the only thing that differs between 2 groups is the independent variable, whatever you are conscientiously varying. And then random assignment kind of takes care of the rest. It takes care of all the differences that participants are coming into the study with. It balances out groups. So again, the only real difference on average between the 2 groups is what you manipulate. So that at the end of the study, if there's any difference between the 2 groups, or at least I should say any significant difference, which we'll get to later, any sizable difference, it must be due to the things that you are manipulating, because theoretically that's the only thing that should be different between the 2 groups. And again, no one experiment is perfect, but if you have multiple experiments that seem to be very, well orchestrated and have good methods, and they're all showing the same thing, that's really a good sign that your theory is on the right track. So those were the sort of the advantage of experiments, is that they can really support hypotheses and theories about causality. One of the disadvantages is that sometimes experiments, or at least true experiments, are impossible to do. So sometimes it's not ethical to randomly assign people into different groups. This is why we can, and we really probably will never be able to, do an experiment on the effects of smoking on lung cancer, for instance. This is because it would be unethical to randomly assign people to, smoke a pack a day. So while we find that the relationship between smoking and cancer is extremely high, we can never say 100% that it's true that cancer or smoking causes cancer. This is because we can't, take 100 people, randomly assign 50 to smoke and 50 to not, and then see if the 50 who smoke are more likely to die of cancer. There's no ethics board in the United States that would ever allow an experiment to be done like that. We can do it on animals, we can't do it on humans. And so, that's why people, lobbyists and smoking companies will say, well, there's no experimental evidence or there's no, 100% infallible evidence that smoking causes cancer. Well, that's true. That's just because we cannot ethically do that type of study. It's also hard when we look at the effect of, traumatic or just important life events, like adoption. So it's really hard to say whether or not adoption harms children, helps children, compared to children who are non-adopted. And that's just simply because we can't take a group of kids who are just born and randomly assign 50% to be raised by their parents and 50% to be adopted. We can try to find comparable groups of kids, kids of relatively the same social economic status and neighborhood and ethnicity. But in the end, there's still probably a lot of other factors, participant factors, that are going to be different between a group of kids who is adopted and a group of kids who isn't. And that's just something, unless we do a true experiment on it, we can't control for all that. And then there are also a lot of variables that just literally cannot be manipulated at all. So for example, if we're looking at the effect of race on academic success, like the study we talked about before, where they in particular looked at African Americans, you can't obviously experimentally manipulate whether someone's an African American or Caucasian or Latino or Asian. That's just something we're born with. And there's lots of things that we're born with, particularly anything that has to do with our genetics that you just can't experimentally manipulate in the lab. And so you really can't run a true experiment on it. We'll get to what's called quasi-experiments later on in the semester, and they have ways of dealing with that sort of thing. So a real big issue, and something that we've sort of been talking implicitly about, but here we'll talk explicitly about it, is validity. So validity is, can you trust the results of your study? Or does your study accurately reflect the truth? And there are two ways of talking about this, and they tend to be two ways that are really important in terms of how valuable is our science. So one is called external validity. External validity is how much does your study reflect what happens in the real world. So some studies have really good external validity. For example, any study that has naturalistic observations, so observations where you're just looking at people in the real world, doing real world things, these studies tend to have really good external validity. So the study where they inobtrusively observe people in the bathroom and whether or not they wash their hands, we can be very sure that that reflects real world behavior because it was captured, that was actual behavior captured in the real world. People didn't even know that they were being observed at the time. So in that way, that study has really good external validity. The other important part of validity, though, is internal validity. And this is, do we know what caused variance in the dependent variable? Do we know what caused behavior or emotions or cognition within the study? So for example, that naturalistic observation study with the bathroom behavior, that has low internal validity because we don't know in that study what caused people to either wash their hands or not wash their hands. This is where experiments come in. So experiments with experimental control and randomization, they have really high internal validity because if you're controlling for everything except for, well, you're still controlling it for, but nothing's varying significantly between groups except for the independent variable, you can rest assured that if there's differences in the groups at the end of the experiment, it must be due to that independent variable. So if we wanted to know, what could cause people to wash their hands more? Could it be learning more about germs? Could it be having someone else in the bathroom observing them? We could run that experiment. We could have people come into a lab and optimally they wouldn't know the aim of the experiment, but we could manipulate the bathroom in some way, either maybe putting in a camera over the sink or having a Confederate stand there and watch them, or perhaps just having them read a little pamphlet or watch a video on germ transmission, and then measure whether or not they wash their hands in the sink. So in this way, an experiment would have, if it employs control and randomization, a really good idea of what the effect of these things could have on washing your hands after going to the bathroom. But in that case, they would be kind of weak in external validity because the participants do, in fact, know that they're taking part in an experiment, and so their behavior might be totally different than it would be in the wild. So this is the thing with validity, especially internal and external validity, is that internal validity requires that you control everything in the environment and employ randomization. So in this case, it means you have to do it in a lab setting or in a setting where you can control the environment and randomize people into different groups, different exposure to different stimuli, all that sort of thing. So it basically requires that you run experiments. Whereas external validity requires that you look at behavior naturalistically. So you can really observe what people do, not just in the lab, but in the real world. Because it's likely if people know that they're being watched, especially when it comes to sensitive behavior like washing your hands after you go to the bathroom, it's probably that they're going to change their behavior than what they would do in real life. It's very likely that if people knew that they were being experimented on, they would wash their hands 100% of the time because they know that someone's watching them. So it's one of those things where there's a real balancing act when it comes to validity. If you're running an experiment, you're likely going to have high internal validity where you know exactly what's causing behavior, you've controlled for everything, so you know you can make you can test hypotheses on cause and effect rather, but you're going to be low in external validity because people know they're being tested on. Whereas if you can run a field experiment, you're usually doing it in an environment where you have very little control over what people are being exposed to, what their behavior is, what's shaping it, but at least you know you're getting at real-world behavior. So good research combines multiple methods. Good research will have a series of studies, either in one article, usually multiple articles, where they run non-experiments, where they look at people in the field, they take surveys, they maybe even record archival data or case studies. And all of these have high external validity because they're real-world behavior. And these all satisfy the sort of beginning goals of science, the induction goals of science, where you're describing behavior, trying to predict it, even if you don't quite know what the cause of it is, and you're making observations in order to make new theories. So this is good in the induction center of theory development and sort of turning out hypotheses that can later be tested experimentally. So after you've done that, after you've sort of gotten a feel for what behavior is like in the real world, then you can run experiments in which you try to figure out what's causing that behavior and maybe how to change that behavior. So these types of studies, of course, have high internal validity and really get at the causation explanation aspects of science. So they're a way to test hypotheses and maybe even reform theories. So for example, if you figure out, okay, people aren't washing their hands as much as they maybe should in the real world, but we find that by installing a camera inside the bathroom, which of course has some ethical quandaries about it, but installing it not on the stalls, but on the over the sinks, you might be able to raise washing frequency. Then maybe you could then in turn turn that into a naturalist observation study where you then put cameras into a public setting and seeing if it has any effect there. So often experiments will feed into field research will feed into experiments. So it creates a sort of cycle of induction and deduction where you're constantly creating and revamping theories through hypothesis testing. To give an example of what I mean, let me run you through a hypothesis that's been tested in a lot of different ways. We're just going to cover a few that encompass some non-experimental and experimental methods. So the hypothesis this time is that anonymity, so being able to do something without other people knowing about it, or being able to give responses or behave in such a way so that no one finds out that it's you, qualifiers of anonymity, tend to lead to less moral behavior. So the theory goes that if you know that you're not going to be judged by other people, it sort of allows you to do things that you might want to do, but wouldn't because you'd be afraid of other people judging you. So it kind of makes sense. And one study I really like on this is a naturalistic observation study. So they sort of set up a little experiment in the field, and this was on Halloween night. And it was a very simple experiment, and probably one that a lot of people have inadvertently done without really recording the data on it. So they put out a big bowl of Halloween candy with a sign that said, please only take one piece. And then the researchers were out of sight. They were basically behind some bushes, not too technical here, with a clipboard and some note paper. And they took note of how many children took one piece and how many took more than one piece. And they paid special attention to the anonymity of the children. In this case, did they come in groups where they could sort of lose or basically be not held accountable as an individual, or were they individual kids who could easily be seen, taking multiple pieces of candy out of the bowl? So what they found was that if children came in groups and thus their individual behavior was more anonymous, about 60% of them took more than one piece of candy. However, if the kids came one by one, in case of singular children, only 20% of them took more than one piece. So it sort of at least supported the conclusion that being alone, being less anonymous, easier to single out, led to less bad behavior. Or the converse, being anonymous, being hard to single out, led to more bad behavior. Now, with all naturalistic observation studies, there's a lot of things that the experimenters couldn't control. So it's really hard to say that this anonymous factor was the one thing that caused this difference in behavior. So, for example, you could point to a lot of differences. So kids who go in groups, they might let's say if you have 20% of kids who are going to basically steal candy or take more than one piece anyway, you're likely to have at least one of them in a group of 5 kids. And so maybe if the other kids see that one bad apple taking more than one piece, they're going to be more likely to sort of mimic his behavior or her behavior. You also get maybe a bit of a peer pressure thing going on, where if you have a big group of kids and one of them says, hey, let's all take more than one piece, you might feel pressured, even if you don't really want to do that if you're a kid. So there's lots of different explanations. Could also be that the kids who go by themselves are, I don't know, it's kind of a sad theory, but maybe they have less friends, they're more socially isolated, more socially anxious. Maybe it's something about that leads them to be less likely to steal extra pieces of candy. So again, there's no experimental control here, and especially there's no randomization. There's no experimenter randomly assigning each kid to either go up by themselves or in a group, because that would in effect rule out a lot of these confounds. So you sort of add that to archival research, which again is non-experimental. So lots of research shows, and I don't think this is a big surprise to anybody, that more crime, basically more bad or less moral behavior, happens at night, and especially in low-light areas. It's actually one of those interesting things that people who manage cities can do to actively combat crime, is just to make their city brighter. So lots of studies have shown that actually adding extra street lamps to a city block does more than a lot of other tactics, like adding more police to the police force, adding night watch or surveillance watch programs to lower crimes in neighborhoods. So just making things brighter lessens crime. Theory goes because it makes people less anonymous, easier to single out and spot. There's also been some more semi-more experimental methods to look at this in the field. So one such study had an office building either put their lights on high on 100% or dim them to about 60%. Their theory was that if the lights were lower, more people would steal office supplies because they'd be less easy to sight and spot and all that kind of stuff, more anonymous. And indeed, that's what they found. They saw actually a dramatic increase in stolen office supplies when the lights were dimmed. This was pretty easy to do just by checking their inventories at the end of the month. So again, both of these lack experimental control. They lack randomization. They lack being able to make sure everybody has the exact same environment except for one thing being differed, like anonymity or in this case, light. But still, all of these non-experimental methods have good external validity. So we can tell with pretty strong confidence that if we do lower the lights in an area, or if we live in a neighborhood with lower lights, there's going to be more crime. Now, whether it's anonymity causing this or something else, you know, that's open for debate. I mean, one other potential cause of this, and a pretty simple one to figure out, is that it's not so much the anonymity, it's just that people maybe associate the dark with bad behavior. Maybe, you know, we tend to have, even in our nomenclature, our language, that when we see someone or something, maybe a movie that's really dark, so to speak, what does it mean? It means that there's morally ambiguous characters. It means there's morally bad things going on. So there could be other explanations here for it. Could maybe not even just a sense of anonymity, but a sense that, hey, I can do something without anybody seeing me, which is very close to anonymity, but a little bit more of a practical thing as opposed to a psychological thing of not being caught. So more archival research, I think you get some really interesting research just looking at different cultures with this, and one that gets away from just the darkness adding to anonymity. In this case, anonymity can also come from wearing masks or wearing war paint or things that distort how people see you. So lots of sociological studies have found that cultures who do wear war masks and war paint, like here on the left we have a group from Papua New Guinea wearing war masks versus a tribe in Indonesia who doesn't wear war masks or war paint, making them much easier to single out and spot, so they're not nearly as anonymous. We find that cultures who wear the paint and wear the masks tend to be much more violent. They tend to use torture, they tend to kill more, and that's been found across a lot of different cultures. Taking a more Western look, cultures that use uniforms and thus sort of can easier blend in the crowd, and in other words, increase their anonymity. So if you're wearing a uniform that's identical to thousands of other people, you're harder to single out, so you're more anonymous. The cultures who do that versus those like the Apache Indians, who were very easy to single out, they all wore something different. They actually wore signifiers of their individuality in combat. They tend to be much less violent than those who all wore the same uniforms. Now, again, there's lots of other potential explanations. That's the problem with all these naturalistic or non-experimental methods. There are many ways to explain this. So, for example, and this is just some things that have been brought up, you can come up with many examples of alternative explanations. But one thing is that if you are a very violent culture, like those in Papua New Guinea who do actively torture and kill neighboring tribes, it behooves you to wear a mask because then your enemies can't spot you. And then your enemies can't come back and say, hey, you are the guy who, killed my sister, now I'm going to kill you. So it lessens chances for being retaliated against in a singular way, in a sort of an individualized way. Another thing is that masks, uniforms, they tend to give off the air that people are very unified and maybe even sort of non-human, and that can be very intimidating in battle. And in fact, studies have shown that, and again, it's hard to tease out cause and effect, but it is true that cultures that wear masks, that wear war paint or uniforms, tend to be more successful in combat. Maybe it unites them, maybe it intimidates their enemies, but for whatever reason, maybe this is just correlated, the success in combat is correlated with the increased violence. So it's not that, the mask is making people more violent, it's that more violent people wear masks and are more successful in combat. So lots of different explanations, but again, we're finding a lot of things that sort of center around increasing anonymity and causing or leading to less moral behavior. So none of these refute that theory, but none are perfect supporters either. So okay, let's get to more experiments here. And I just have a couple of them here, but I think these are somewhat interesting ones. So one of them was done quite a while ago by Zimbardo. You might remember him, Zimbardo, from being the guy behind the Stanford Prison Study. So this is actually before that study. This was during his graduate school years. So one of them he wanted to figure out was, what's the effect of anonymity, again, on bad behavior? And he wanted to do this in a more direct way. So he manipulated anonymity by having people either wear baggy clothing with a hood and not wearing any kind of name tag or any kind of identifier, so in effect making them much harder to spot in a crowd, versus having participants wear their normal clothing and a name tag to make them less anonymous. So in this case, they're using good experimental tactics because all these people were randomly assigned, so anyone who might be less moral coming into the experiment, they have just as likely a chance of being assigned to the baggy clothed anonymous condition as the normal clothed name tagged non-anonymous condition. So then he ran them through a study that was very akin to the Milgram study. We haven't talked about this class, but hopefully you've heard about it before. It's one where they assign a participant to be a teacher and then assign a confederate who seems like a participant to be the learner. And the learner, the confederate, who is basically an actor, pretends to be doing really bad at the task, and the experimenter tells the teacher, who's the actual participant, whenever the learner fails, you need to electrocute them, and then they ask the participant, normally in the normal Milgram experiment, to increase the voltage of electricity every time to sort of see how far someone will go in hurting someone else just at the request of the experimenter. So again, that's a kind of a complex thing, but hopefully you guys have heard about that before. If not, go to Wikipedia and check it out. It's a really interesting study. So what they did in this one is they just assigned, again, people to the anonymous versus non-anonymous condition, and they let them pick the voltage that they were going to shock their learner at, and how long they were going to shock them, how long they were going to press down that lever. And that's what they recorded as signs of aggression, or basically immoral behavior. And they indeed found that those who were in the anonymous condition, they shocked participants for longer periods, they shocked them at higher voltage levels, as opposed to those in the non-anonymous condition. So this was a pretty good one in that the people were randomly assigned, everyone was treated the same, except for whether they wore baggy clothes or a name tag, so except for the independent variables. So we have that experimental control and randomization on our side. So something about that condition caused less moral behavior. Again, you can question, is it anonymity per se? One alternative explanation that's come up is maybe these people who are made to wear baggy clothing in a time during the season when it wouldn't have been normal to wear baggy clothing, maybe that just made them hot. And lots of studies have shown that when people are hot, just temperature-wise, they tend to get more angry, they tend to get more aggressive. So maybe all this study was showing that by making people put on hot, baggy clothes, you make them more aggressive. Again, it's debatable because there's no one perfect experiment. Each one's going to have different operational definitions. You could also argue that the shocking part here isn't necessarily a sign of immoral behavior, because if the participant thinks, hey, if I shock them more, they're going to learn faster, maybe they're actually trying to be a better participant if they're shocking them at higher voltages and for a longer period of time. They're saying, well, I just want this learner to learn more quickly and more efficiently. So again, no experiment is perfect, or no one experiment is perfect. But there's been several like this, one that's similar to that office experiment we saw before, but again, a more true experiment fashion using randomization and experimental control. This one was one where they had participants who were mostly undergraduates come into a classroom-like setting, and the classroom setting was either half lit, so very dimly lit, and again, theoretically providing a sense of anonymity, not being singled out as easily, all that kind of stuff, versus a fully lit room. So what they did in this experiment is they had participants solve math problems, and they had a long list of pretty difficult math problems. They said, okay, try to solve as many as you can in 5 minutes, and for each one you solve, you get $1. So you get a payout per math problem that you successfully solve. So at the end of the 5-minute session, they allowed people to grade their own math problems, and then throw their sheet into the trash and just verbally report to the experimenter how many they'd completed successfully. So it basically provides 2 opportunities to cheat. They can, 1, say that they completed more correctly than they did, and then 2, they can say that they completed more than they maybe even attempted, because they, in effect, removed the evidence by throwing it in the trash, and then just verbally reported, oh yeah, I did 10 math problems, give me my $10, basically. So, of course, afterward, all the exams were picked up from the trash. They all had identifiable numbers on them that corresponded to the participants they were handed out to. So even though participants never put their name on it, they were able to identify exactly who had each math paper, and they were able to quantify cheating in this way. So what they found was, indeed, there was a huge difference between the dimly lit room and the fully lit room. In this case, there was 3 times more cheating, or more questions said were done correctly than actually were, in the dimly lit room. So this is a very strong effect. It's kind of one of those things I've thought about as a teacher. If I'm doing a test, I actually do try to make it as bright as possible in there, not just to deter cheating, but also to make it easier to read the papers, to help keep people awake. But this is another reason why it's good to, do tests in a brightly lit room as opposed to a dimly lit room. It's a very interesting finding. But again, even though they used experimental control and randomization, you could potentially come up with different explanations for it. So one thing, and I haven't heard this from other researchers on this particular study, but one thing I could think of is that if I was in a room that was very dimly lit, my vision's not the greatest, I would probably be very frustrated trying to take this test in a room where I'm having a hard time reading the test questions off the sheet because it's so dim. So, in that condition, I might think to myself, well, I only got 3 math problems correct, but if this room wasn't so dimly lit and I didn't have such a hard time reading the sheet, maybe I would have, completed 6 of the math problems, because I was really just, my performance was weakened by how dimly lit this area was. So maybe I wouldn't so much, well, I would be cheating if I said I completed 6 problems, but maybe it wasn't so much that, I felt like it was anonymous and couldn't be caught. Maybe it was that I just felt like the lighting in the room was disadvantageous to my actual test performance, and so I'm going to correct for that a little bit in my own mind. So anyway, I don't know how valid that explanation would be to account for 3 times as much cheating, but you can always come up with a potential alternate explanation. So on the one hand, that's sort of the frustrating thing about science is you do have to do lots of different studies to sort of rule out all these alternative explanations. But with I think I presented about 6 studies there, or about 6 main findings. With all these findings tending to converge on the same explanation, you have more and more support for a central idea. So just to sort of run you through that quickly, I just wanted to put it here in the lecture slide, so it's something you can refer back to. Each of these experiments or naturalistic studies or archival studies, none of them are conclusive on their own. So this is one of those things that when a new study comes out and it's on a totally new theory, and it seems to support that theory, most scientists, at least good ones, are still going to treat it with a lot of caution. You might go, well, there's only been 1 study on this. There's all these alternative explanations. There needs to be more research. And that's sort of one of the things that scientists say all the time. There needs to be more research. But here we have a lot of studies that seem to hint that anonymity, making it harder to single people out, to make people responsible, tends to lead to bad behavior. There seems to be a lot of evidence for that, but again, each of these has an alternative explanation that could just as easily explain the individual findings. So with the kids, taking more candy, maybe there's peer pressure involved. So maybe groups caused more cheating in this sense, more candy taking, not because they led to anonymity of individuals, but simply because they led to more peer pressure of individuals. Maybe more crime happens at night because, not for sort of a psychological feeling of anonymity, but for a practical reason that people are less likely to see you. So, if you would commit a crime, whether you felt anonymous or not, maybe you're just more likely to in that opportunity when you're least likely to be caught. With the cultures with the face paint and the masks, again, adding anonymity, maybe the only reason they're more violent is because more violent cultures wear these things. Maybe to keep their enemies from recognizing them, maybe for intimidation reasons, maybe to increase solidarity among the troops in a sense that we're all one. But for whatever reason, it might not be that the war paint / masks makes people more violent. It may just be that more violent people choose these methods when going to war. Again, even the experiment, so wearing bulky clothing, which would seem to make someone feel more anonymous, especially versus normal clothing plus a name tag, maybe that didn't lead to a sense of anonymous, which led to bad behavior. Maybe it just led to people feeling really hot and uncomfortable, which then led to them to be more aggressive, or maybe even led them to act more moral and thus more following the orders of the experimenter and really giving the participant high voltage during the shocks because they wanted to be good participant themselves. So it's kind of ambiguous whether their behavior is really bad. That really depends on their intention behind it. And again, like with a dimly lit classroom, maybe it's not that the dim lights added to more anonymity and thus more cheating. Maybe they just made people more frustrated taking the tests and thus more likely to sort of correct for the dim lighting in their own assessments of their performance. So yeah, I only got 3 right, but if it was a well-lit room, I would have gotten 5 or 6 right. So that's what I'll say. So each of these supports the theory, but it doesn't prove the theory. And again, that's sort of the frustrating angle on science, and this is why scientists are very rare to ever say that a theory is proven true. They can say, well, it's very well supported by years of research, but you don't want to go on a limb and say that it's absolutely true, because the next study that comes along could refute it. And this is one of the reasons why a very important thing that we do in psychology, and a relatively new thing, this has actually only been around well, since about the 80s, but really caught on in the 2000s, are what we call review articles. So these articles use statistics, specifically made, a lot of them in the 1980s and 90s, to analyze lots of studies in one go, to sort of go, okay, well, we've had, let's say, 60 studies on this whole anonymity leading to bad behavior. Let's analyze the data from all of these studies at once and sort of tease apart the effects and see if this is a real thing going on. So review articles are a great way of looking at lots of research at once. And they're such an important thing now, we even have journals specifically devoted to them. So these are good journals like American Psychology, one of the top read journals in psychology, is mostly full of review articles. And then some like Annual Review of Psychology sort of tackles maybe 10 or 12 big topics in psychology that year, reviews all the research on them, tries to either validate or refute competing theories. So these are really, really important types of research being done, or types of writings and analyses being done. And they're actually really cool journals. I suggest these journals for all undergrads who are interested in psychology because they tend to be a great way to introduce you to a new topic, totally catch you up with what's going on in the field. And they tend to be written, especially for American Psychology and Annual Review of Psychology, they tend to be written in a way that's very accessible even to people who have no background in the specific topic being discussed. So they are meant to sort of introduce people to a topic they might not be familiar with. So really great journals to read. And they're both cataloged and subscribed to in our local library. So you can get on those by either visiting the library or going online and looking that up as a resource. Okay, so one of these things that these types of journals have a lot of are what we call meta-analyses. And meta-analyses are, again, relatively new in terms of being used in psychology. They've been used a lot in biology, physics, chemistry, but they're sort of getting caught on now in psychology as a way to statistically analyze a lot of different studies at once. And it's the statistics gets very complex when you're talking about meta-analysis, so I'm not going to go into at all in this course how to do a meta-analysis. That's something you'd cover in grad school, and even then you could cover that in post-grad years, and even professors have a hard time explaining exactly what are the best procedures. So I'm not going to even attempt to get into the mathematics of it, but just suffice it to say it's a way to analyze a lot of data from a lot of different studies at once. And you can, come to some very interesting findings doing this. So sort of bringing this home with this whole idea of anonymity leading to bad behavior, there's a study done in the late 90s that looked at 60 such studies. So they called it de-individuation, which just is another word for anonymity. And so they ended up getting data from 60 individual studies covering 4,700 plus participants and looking across all these conditions. So actually all of the experiments that I talked about are, except for the sociological ones where it talked about different cultures, all the other ones are discussed and analyzed in this one research article. So again, a great article to read to sort of catch you up on this specific topic. So they looked at all of these effects of anonymity on bad behavior, and they found that the effect did exist. It was statistically viable, and they said it's very, very likely this is a true effect, but it's actually very, very small. So while we have some studies like the ones that I cited where they tend to find better effects, so for example, the one with the kids where 60% of the kids in the group condition versus 20% of the kids in the non-group condition stole extra candy, where there are 3 times as much cheating in the dimly lit classroom versus the well-lit classroom. Overall, this effect, or these large effects, tend to be tampered down by lots of other studies with either very small effects, null effects, or even opposite effects. So just sort of give you an idea of what they found, this is a graph showing all the different types of effect sizes that they found for the effect of anonymity on what they call anti-normative behavior, basically just bad behavior like cheating, violence, all that kind of stuff. So what they found here is that, yes, there's a lot of studies. So this is on the side of finding a positive correlation or a positive effect size. That in fact, a lot of studies have found that more anonymity leads to bad behavior. There are also quite a bit of studies that find that there's really no correlation. In fact, I would sort of lump in all of these around zeros, meaning that there's probably very little effect of anonymity to bad behavior. And then there are some studies that are kind of minority, but there are some published studies that find that anonymity can even lead to good behavior. In this case is, some that even found a very strong effect between anonymity and good behavior. So what data analyses like meta-analysis can do is it can analyze all this at once and say, okay, what's the average effect? So the average effect ended up being quite small. Now this also hints that there might be something very different about these studies and maybe the way they're operationalizing anonymity or measuring bad behavior versus these studies over here, because it's surprising to get completely opposite effects for different studies. Maybe some are more methodologically sound, or maybe they just treat anonymity and bad behavior in a very different way. So that's of course discussed in this literature as well. So not only do they look at the average effect, they also find out things like what leads to maybe the most poor behavior. So indeed they found that anonymity by and large did lead to bad behavior. So especially when anonymity was operationalized in a way that made people harder to single out, made basically bad behavior harder to actually see. Because some of the studies, if we go back here, some of these studies manipulate anonymity by having people, for instance, read a paper about, read a paper about an anonymous person to try to give a greater sense of psychological anonymity. And that sometimes doesn't yield a very big effect or maybe even an opposite effect. But they found the studies that actually manipulated people's anonymity and made it literally harder for their behavior to be known by others, that tended to create more bad behavior in a more reliable way than other operations of anonymity. They also find that the anonymity had the greatest effects on cheating and lying. So they found that when they looked at, for instance, studies like the one we talked about, like the Milgram study, where they had one participant actually shock another, those tended to have very mixed results. But when it was on things like taking extra candy or answering extra, or saying you answered problems correctly that you actually didn't, those tend to be producing very reliable effects. So indeed, anonymity tends to produce more lying and cheating behavior, at least in times when it's not really going to hurt anybody else. So, and that's interesting also because that's what more bad behavior in real life falls in line with. So you're, in a convenience store and you think, well, I'm just going to take this candy bar. It's not really going to hurt anybody. You might be more likely to do that if the store is dimly lit, if you're wearing baggy clothing that day for whatever reason, if nobody's around to see you, more likely to do that sort of thing. You're not as likely to go up and just, smack someone up on the back of the head or electrically shock them if you're not going to get caught. So that's sort of, a nice thing is that people aren't that bad. They're just likely to be a little less moral if it's in a way that doesn't really hurt someone else, in at least a direct way. Might also explain, let me just go back for a second, that might really explain why, stealing and torrenting and electronic theft is so common on the internet, because the internet is, or at least it seems, very anonymous. So that's one way in which, this research could go in, is how can this explain theft on the internet versus real life? Okay, so another thing that I thought was really interesting is they found the effect was much stronger on children versus adults. And they found basically, we talked about, let me go back again for a second, that the effect was very small. I didn't really discuss this, but an R of 0.09, we talked about this a little bit. We know it's positive because this isn't a negative number, but it's very close to 0. So, round this up to about a 0.1, that's a very weak effect. But they found that when they tested this effect on children, the effect of anonymity, like being in a group, being in the dark, having your face hidden, actually had an R of about 0.3 when it came to creating cheating behavior. So in effect, it tripled the effect size when it came to the effect of anonymity on bad behavior. So this means that, as we get to be older, we sort of probably choose our own behavior, our own morality, based more on our own individual beliefs and our personalities. Whereas when we're kids, we're a bit more opportunistic. So it's not, I think a lot of kids have stories where they shoplifted as a kid, but never did so as an adult, just because they became more morally centered on their own beliefs and less on just the situation. And they actually found that when they tested the effects of anonymity on full-grown non-college adults, they found no effect at all. So it really seemed to be something that could only be found in kids on the strong end, and college students on sort of the weaker end, around the R equals 0.1. And when they looked at non-college community samples, they really didn't find any effect at all. So that again, is a very interesting finding. So these are sort of the benefits of meta-analysis, is that they can provide insight that no one study can. So by looking at sort of the big picture of what's going on in the field, they can see, for example, what factors lead to the biggest effects, what factors may lead to opposite effects or opposing effects. That's something I didn't really discuss too much, but I talked a little bit about how maybe a study that used a hypothetical scenario or tried to increase anonymity purely psychologically didn't tend to have as big effects as if they used real anonymity like a dark room or baggy clothing. They can also really hint at the real effect sizes, because lots of studies come out that might have differing effect sizes just because of the particulars of that individual study. So maybe one study has a big effect size because they're doing a study on children, and they don't know that children are more affected by anonymity, whereas another study comes along that does a study on, let's say, 50 to 70-year-old seniors. They find no effect. Well, it's hard to see that that's a really noticeable difference if you're just looking at studies individually, but if you can sort of analyze them all together, these types of differences jump out. It can also uncover confounds. We didn't really talk much about confounds in here, but perhaps the reason why they did find that anonymity, quote-unquote, led to more electric shock in that one study, but didn't find it in any of the other studies, or most of the other studies where they attempted to have one participant hurt another. Maybe this was because those baggy clothing really just made people hotter and thus more aggressive. Maybe it wasn't that it led to more anonymity, it just led to more discomfort, which that in turn led to more shocking of other people. So we can sort of say, well, that's more likely to be a confound of that study because other studies that tried to manipulate anonymity in other ways, they couldn't seem to get participants to hurt one another very reliably. They can also, of course, uncover bias in experiments, for example, an over-reliance on college samples. So that was a big surprise, is that we found a lot of studies that found an effect of anonymity on violence and, mostly cheating and lying, but most of these were either done with college samples or with kids. So it was really interesting to compare those to ones done with, adults age 25 and older, where really no effect at all was found. And so a good place for future research could go, okay, why is that the case? Is it that adults out of college have a more what we call crystallized personality and morality system, and so suddenly having the opportunity to cheat doesn't necessarily overpower their own internal morality, where that might happen more so in children and somewhere in the middle for teenagers. But a great thing too is that it can test multiple competing theories at once. So one thing I didn't really get into that meta-analysis article is that they tested a lot of different theories of why anonymity might lead to bad behavior, and some were supported and some weren't. Some were purely situational, more opportunistic, if I can get away with this, I should do it, whereas others were more psychological. So anonymity might make you less aware of your own morality systems and thus more likely to cheat. So clearly in the studies that they looked at, and they tried to get as many studies as possible on the subject, the first theory seemed to be more supported, that cheating and lying was more common in a more opportunistic way, and especially for younger individuals, where you're just in the grocery store as a kid or as a teenager, people are looking away, you think, well, if I steal that, I'm not going to get caught, it doesn't really hurt anybody, so you do it. But if you're an adult it's not like the sudden feeling of anonymity makes you forget your own morality system, that cheating is wrong and all that sort of stuff. Might also explain why kids are much more likely to BitTorrent and steal things online than an older crowd. Okay, so that's sort of psychological theory in a nutshell. I realize this is quite a long lecture. This is definitely going to be the longest lecture of all the single lectures in this unit. But it's a good one to sort of introduce you to a lot of stuff that hopefully you've kind of covered in other classes. So this is a big refresher lecture on things like correlation, the basic steps of science, which hopefully you've covered in other classes, whether it be psychology, Psych 1, or bio, or chemistry. I'm sure a lot of these subjects overlap between all the sciences. But this is to more introduce you to these ideas, especially in terms of psychology, in terms of, affect, behavior, and cognition. And it's also to let you know about all the methods and statistical procedures, which we're going to get a lot more into as the semester goes on. So this is not only sort of a refresher, but sort of a premiere of a lot of different things that we're going to end up talking about as the semester goes on. So that's it for this talk.